One, the Environmental Justice for All Act. Under Committee Rule 4F, any oral opening statements at the hearings are limited to the chair and the ranking minority member or their designees. This will allow us to hear from our witnesses sooner and help members keep to their schedule. Therefore, I ask unanimous consent that all other members' opening statements be made part of the hearing record. They are submitted to the clerk by 5 p.m. today or at the close of the hearing, whichever comes first. Hearing no objection, so ordered. I also ask unanimous consent that Representative Carolyn Maloney be join the hearing to ask questions of the witnesses. Hearing no objections, so ordered. Without objection, the chair may also declare a recess subject to the call of the chair. As described in the notice, statements, documents, or motions must be submitted to the electronic repository at hnrc.mail.house.gov. Additionally, please note that as always, members are responsible for their own microphones, and as with our in-person meetings, members can be muted by staff only to avoid inadvertent background noise. Finally, members or witnesses experiencing technical problems should inform the committee immediately. I will now recognize myself for 5 minutes for my opening statement and then turn to the ranking member. And again, I want to welcome everyone to this hearing and thank our witnesses for testifying about one of the most stark and quantifiable inequities under our current laws, the lack of environmental justice for all. We are here today to discuss H.R. 2021, the Environmental Justice for All Act. This legislation was developed and shaped directly by environmental justice communities during an extensive public engagement process. The bill on today's agenda has many components, but it's based on a very simple principle and premise. All people have the right to clean air, clean water, and an environment that enriches their lives. Far too many across our country, for all those people, these rights are not realized or, in fact, acknowledged. Today, environmental justice communities, including communities of color, tribal and indigenous communities, and poor and working class communities, continue to be disproportionately burdened by pollution and harmful climate effects. This includes significantly greater exposure to polluted air, water, and landscapes. All this in EJ communities. A major factor that has been the fossil fuel industry and the other polluting industries having a long and troubled history of intentionally building projects that pollute surrounding neighborhoods within communities of color and poor communities. The numbers and statistics are clear and quantifiable and evident, which we'll hear more about today in the testimony from our witnesses. In my hometown and where I now live and grew up, all permitted emissions, discharges, and the groundwater contamination that followed uh, detached and created a Superfund site that is still an ongoing cleanup here in this community. We see this clear environmental injustice through, through less equitable access to environmental amenities like parks, green spaces, public recreation opportunities, and less federal investment in clean energy and clean drinking water projects that serve EJ communities. Addressing these disparities also demands our attention and our action. I've been proud over the last few years to work with Representative McEachin on a comprehensive piece of legislation to address environmental injustice, racism, and discrimination. The legislation before us furthers environmental justice objectives in a variety of ways. The bill includes several provisions to ensure more equitable access to parks and outdoor recreation opportunities for underserved and poor communities. The bill requires federal agencies to provide early and meaningful community involvement opportunities under NEPA when proposing an action affecting an environmental justice community and strengthens the role and input that tribal communities can have in their consultations and their opportunity to be heard under NEPA. The bill strengthens and restores civil rights protections for communities facing greater environmental hazards on the basis of race, color, or national origin, including through programs administered by the Interior Department and other federal agencies under the committee's jurisdiction. The bill also increases transparency, coordination, and accountability from federal agencies when they are carrying out activities affecting environmental justice communities. Today, we'll hear from several witnesses who are experts in their fields and also experts in their lived experiences working with and living in environmental justice communities. I hope their testimony today will inform our community about the urgent need to empower communities to protect their local environment and realize their right to clean air, clean water, and healthy outdoor places. These rights are not being met for far too many communities, and doing something about it is what today's hearing is all about. And before I turn to the ranking member, Westerman, for his opening statement, let me just ask my colleagues to take a moment and picture landfills, waste disposal sites, gas-fired power plants, sewage treatment plants, emissions, and discharges that have to be permitted by law because they fall under the requirements for air quality and water quality. Decrepit infrastructure that brings the water and energy to these communities, and transportation, and the lack of recreation and green space for those communities to enjoy. I ask you to look at that, to just picture that. And now picture where all that is in your community, in the district you represent, in the state that you're from. Picture that. And then you'll see why this piece of legislation that we're having a hearing about today is needed. It's real, and this is, I think, a comprehensive approach to addressing that. With that, I yield now to the ranking member, Mr. Westerman, for his opening statement. Sir, you're recognized.
Well, Chair Grijalva, this is Stauber. I will be the ranker today. Mr. Westerman could not join us.
My apologies. I just noticed that, and with that, let me turn to you for your opening statement, sir.
Thank you, Chairman Grijalva, and thank you to the witnesses for taking the time to join us today. HR 2021, titled the Environmental Justice for All Act, and sponsored by the chairman, truthfully is a legislative vehicle for more of the same from this majority. When Americans want to get back to work, it creates more red tape. When Americans are getting gouged at the pump, it doubles down on their pain by increasing the cost of production. And when it claims to speak to so-called environmental justice, it plainly misses the mark. For starters, it creates more opportunities for radical special interest groups to do what they do best, that is to file lawsuits and get their lawyers paid while keeping workers on the benches. Specifically, the bill requires federal agencies to develop more reports, more studies, and more comment periods, as if the National Environmental Policy Act, the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, the Endangered Species Act, and every other possible act created does not already exist. Renewable energy, broadband, affordable housing, and almost any new infrastructure will have to clear new studies that will be made into 90-day studies, which inevitably will turn into 6-month studies, because every environmental group in DC is licking its chops at more statutes to tie up in court, billing by the hour. Meanwhile, the at-risk communities we seek to help are missing out on important opportunities to modernize their infrastructure, create jobs, and attract investment. This bill also creates new fees on oil, gas, and coal industries, and creates another government payout scheme. When levying these new fees, it would lead to job loss and eliminate production on federal lands. And therefore, even the bill's new revenue scheme will dry up, once again leaving communities reliant on affordable energy and high-wage jobs high and dry once again. And when we lose these jobs, we lose revenue to schools, we lose revenue and funding for law enforcement and other essential services, while all driving up the cost of gas. According to AAA, Right now, the average price of gas for an Arizonan is $3.66 a gallon, hovering above the national average. Instead of addressing this problem, the majority is proposing to push this cost up even more. Meanwhile, looking abroad, we have Russia, empowered by President Biden's Nord Stream 2 gift, knocking on Ukraine's door. Mr. Chair, energy security is national security. Proposals like this make us less secure and hand another tool to Russia, who is leveraging their corner of the oil and gas market to push its goals. The majority has also failed to invite witnesses from the federal agencies that would implement this bill. So we will not receive the administration's input on this legislation or their analysis on whether the provisions in this bill can be effectively carried out. My guess is these agencies lack the personnel and capacity, but I suppose we will leave that up to our imagination. Last Congress, the majority held a hearing on previous versions of this bill, and Republicans invited Derek Hawley, the president of Reaching America, to testify. Mr. Hawley keenly noted that energy poverty is a huge issue for minority communities across our country, and he urged our committee to focus on increasing access to affordable energy by making federal energy projects easier to build, not more difficult. And Democrats to avoid energy prices are throwing middle-class American families with new questions around the dinner table about how they will afford everyday life. One of the witnesses we will hear from today is from the North Slope of Alaska, where President Biden continues his assault against American energy and recently announced plans to revert management -A to the Obama administration's 2013 Integrated Activity Plan. Even with the of increasing consultation, the position, the counter to its 13-175. So then I ask, which communities under 13-175? Because it certainly is not Mr. Hawley or the Inupiat. Oil and gas production on the North Slope is critical to these communities. One project in particular, the Willow Project within NPRA, would provide thousands of good-paying jobs and crucial funding to address the needs development have enabled North Slope communities to invest in utilities, investing in education. IAP. So if the majority were serious about environmental justice, today's hearing would be about permitting reform and topic the majority focused on in every hearing: more lawsuits, more red tape, and more inflation. I look forward to hearing from the witnesses today. Chairman.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Stauber, and gentlemen yields. And let me just, as I turn to the witnesses for their testimony, let me just remind the witnesses that under our committee rules, they must limit their oral statements to 5 minutes. Their entire statement will appear in the hearing record, and their entire written statement will be part of the hearing record. When you begin to the witnesses, the time will start. It will turn orange when you have 1 minute remaining and red when your time has expired. I recommend that members of witnesses join remotely can use grid view so that they can lock in the timer on their screen. After your testimony is complete, please remember to mute yourself to avoid any background noise. I will allow the entire panel to testify before the members can begin to question the witnesses. I'll begin with the testimony from Ms. Laura Cortez, Co-Executive Director, ECR Communities for Environmental Justice. Ms. Cortez, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Good morning, Chair Grijalva and House Committee on Natural Resources. My name is Laura Jazmin Cortez. I live on unceded Tongva land in Southeast Los Angeles. I am a member organizer and co-executive director with East Yard Communities for Environmental Justice. East Yard works in communities that are overburdened with direct and indirect sources of pollution, from Long Beach to the east side of Los Angeles. And as a community, we work to address soil, air, and water quality. At the intersection of these types of pollution is environmental racism. The Environmental Justice for All Act is both a concrete commitment to the communities that have been harmed and a symbolic sign of respect to communities on the ground doing the work and the committee that put this language together. I will next highlight some of the work our communities are doing in relation to the EJ for All Act that passing this policy would uplift and support. In relation to cumulative impacts, there is no single evil villain polluter in EJ communities. What I see as one of the largest issues is that municipalities and agencies currently treat polluters on a case-by-case basis without assessing cumulative impacts. I grew up next to railroad tracks with trains passing at 3 in the morning. I have always lived within 5 minutes of a refinery and a block away from warehouses. I attended elementary school next to the 710 freeway, which sees 40 to 60,000 truck trips daily. My high school track is immediately next to train tracks. My reality is not an exception. And honestly, community is exposed to so much more at the same time, all the time. These issues in land use and health impacts can be reduced through the creation of effective permitting processes. In relation to outdoor access for all, in a high-density area such as California and Los Angeles specifically, the only spaces that are undeveloped are brownfields. This is why we do work nationally with the Moving Forward Network and locally through the Brownfields to Health Fields work. There's opportunity for policy to create green spaces through investment in the cleanup of these contaminated sites and through community-based processes. And one example of that is Maywood Riverfront Park here in Southeast Los Angeles, a former brownfield that was cleaned and developed as a community open space and is now a thriving social hub. In relation to environmental justice grants programs, federal funding for research in our communities is needed. We have seen research in our communities lead to discoveries that challenge agencies and health thresholds through East Yard's Marina Pando Social Justice Research Collaborative. We have studied through this program lead soil contamination, toxic runoff into the LA River, and more. These studies are done by community members using academic methodology to study the environmental justice issues that our community lacks responses to. The outcomes of these studies are then shared through community events that make sure research is done by our hoods for our hoods. In relation to NEPA, as it has been interpreted in my home of California through CEQA, allows for public participation through an environmental impact report process. In our communities, EIRs are often waived through negative declarations. When EIRs are completed because of many community requests, they do not accurately account for traffic bottlenecks, idling, housing in proximity to polluters, housing affordability, and green space. In fair and just transition, labor in my community looks like folks working at the ports as truck drivers in refineries, waste facilities, and rendering plants. Then coming home to more contaminated soil, air, and water. Therefore, environmental justice will always be linked to labor and a need to protect the health of workers who are also our parents, uncles, sisters, children, and ensuring that they have stable careers. EJ for All proposes Federal Energy Transition Economic Development Assistance Fund that is needed to ensure a just transition in which workers suffering the health impacts of the oil and gas industry can develop the skills to work in healthier systems that we are working towards. Currently, workers feel like they have to choose between their health and income, but that should not be the case. Finally, we are full of solutions. We have the answers. We have been doing this work. Being an EJ community carries a heavy burden and responsibility to fight for ourselves and each other or die slowly. That is not an exaggeration. Passing EJ for All is that serious. Passing any policy that protects human health without giving loopholes to industry is that important. It's life and death. And we must acknowledge that countless EJ community leaders have worked on these types of solutions, and many of them are no longer with us. And now we have this policy as an opportunity to take EJ seriously. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Cortez. And now we're now going to hear next from Dr. Nikki Sheets, Director of the Center for Urban Environment of the John S. Watson Institute for Urban Policy and Research at Keene University. Dr. Sheets, you're recognized for 5 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair Grijalva, and thank you for inviting me here to speak. Thank you to the other members of the committee for allowing me to speak to you today. And I'm going to focus on one aspect of the EJ for All Act that my colleague, Ms. Cortez, talked about, and that's on Section 7 of the EJ for All Act that addresses what is perhaps the preeminent EJ issue in our country today, and that is cumulative impacts. Let me start by giving you a definition for cumulative impacts. You can think of it informally as a total amount of pollution in a neighborhood. More formally, a definition we've been using here in New Jersey is the cumulative impacts consist of the risk and impacts caused by multiple pollutants, by these pollutants both individually and when they interact with each other and any social vulnerabilities that exist in a neighborhood. It is such a critical issue to address cumulative impacts because, unfortunately, numerous reports have found that there are more unwanted land uses in EJ communities, indigenous communities, communities of color, low-income communities. There are more unwanted land uses, including polluting facilities in these communities than in other communities. Thus, there's more exposure to pollution by residents of these communities. And unfortunately, in these communities, there are also social vulnerabilities, as mentioned in the formal definition of cumulative impacts. Think of higher rates of disease, less access to health care, and all forms of racial discrimination. And when you put this together, higher exposure to pollution and social vulnerabilities, you get a combustible mix that results in increased death and illness in these communities. And cumulative impacts is almost certainly one reason why there are persistent and recalcitrant health disparities that exist in our country that are rooted in race and income. More unfortunate news about cumulative impacts is that it is a tough issue to address, again, for several reasons. My colleague mentioned one of them. One reason it's difficult to address is because in our country, we try to address pollution by setting individual standards for pollutants. We go pollutant by pollutant, we set a standard. Unfortunately, one of the big problems with this is that the total amount of pollution in the neighborhood is not accounted for. And so there can be detrimental health impacts to community residents, even if no individual standard is violated. Another problem that cumulative impact has been so difficult to address is because of its association with race and income. Unfortunately, race and income are the two most important factors that go in deciding where unwanted land uses are sited, race often coming out ahead of income in importance in citing decisions. And we all know how difficult it has been for our country to address racial issues of any kind. And when race is an integral part of an issue, like it is with cumulative impacts, it just makes the issue that much harder to address. Let me give you some good news. The EJ community has been successful in moving issues like cumulative impacts from the margins to the mainstream of environmental policymaking discussions. But we haven't been as successful in obtaining significant policy victories And that's where the EJ for All Act comes in. The act says that under certain circumstances, applications for pollution permits should be denied based on cumulative impacts. And this gives hope to EJ communities across the country that the elevated levels of pollution that many of these communities suffer, it gives them hope that there will be a policy that will actually reduce the pollution in their community. I want to end, Chair Grijalva, by saying I'm personally grateful, and I can't speak for all of my EJ colleagues, but I think they are grateful to you and your colleagues on the Natural Resource Committee for strongly considering and recommending adoption of a policy, this cumulative impacts policy, in the center of the EJ for All Act that, if adopted, will result in measurable reductions in pollution in environmental justice communities, and therefore will also result in reducing illness and death in of-color communities and low-income communities all across the country. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk to you this morning. I think I look forward to questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Doctor. And now let me, the chair now recognizes Mayor Harry K. Brower, the mayor of North Slope Borough in Alaska. Mr. Mayor, welcome. You're recognized for 5 minutes. Is the mayor connected? Mr. Mayor, you're recognized. Mr. Mayor, you probably need to unmute. I can hear you, sir. Mayor Brower,
Okay,
welcome,
yeah.
and you're recognized for 5 minutes, sir. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman Grijalva and members of the committee. Thank you for inviting me to speak to you about the Environmental Justice for All Act. This legislation contains many good ideas that are worth pursuing, but parts of this legislation could have serious negative consequences for the people it is intended to protect. My name is Harry Brower Jr. I live in Untitled, Alaska, and I serve as the mayor of the North Slope Borough. I am a whaling captain and a former chairman of the Alaska Eskimo Whaling Commission. The borough is a county-level government. It covers the entire northern region of Alaska, an area about the size of Wyoming. Nearly 80% of the borough's 10,000 residents are Alaska Native. The borough is a unique example of Native people creating a municipal government to advance the self-determination of an entire Native group. The Inupiaq people of our region, in 1971, when the Alaska Native claims were settled by Congress, we were denied the ability to select areas of our traditional lands that had oil and gas potential. The federal government and the state of Alaska had already claimed that land. Our Inupiaq leaders countered this injustice by establishing the North Slope Borough, giving our people the ability to tax oil and gas infrastructure in our region and to use that tax revenue to provide benefits to our communities. Today, 95% of tax revenue that supports the borough comes from tax on oil and gas property in the region. These oil and gas tax revenues support our health clinics, schools, tribal college, water and sewer infrastructure, fire departments, search and rescue services, and other essential services in all our communities. We understand that many federal decisions have had disproportionate negative impacts on the disadvantaged communities. We have had first-hand experience with this on the North Slope. The impulses of right to these historic wrong is good, but I am concerned that well-intended legislation like this bill could empower outside special interest groups to use federal courts to defeat the interests of communities and elected leaders. Many non-governmental organizations claim to represent the interests of the disadvantaged communities. In reality, it is the elected leaders of disadvantaged communities that represent disadvantaged communities. Unfortunately, our decisions and our perspectives do not match up with what some people want to say. Our voices are suddenly silenced. Or perhaps worse, other groups claim to speak for us. This is not the proper way to promote environmental justice for our communities. We faced this reality again recently. For years, the borough worked closely with Bureau of Land Management as a cooperating agency to develop new National Petroleum Reserve in Alaska in the Integrated Activity Plan. BLM developed the IAP in part due to a request from the borough for BLM to reconsider its management of the NPRA. The borough's participation on behalf of our Alaska Native communities within the NPRA was substantial. For example, we cooperated with BLM in the development of various management alternatives for review and commented on the adequacy of the environmental analysis. The final management plan was released in 2020, reflected our input and had our support. At least 10 environmental organizations wrote to the new administration last year asking BLM to reject the new plan. They claimed environmental justice demanded this result because Alaska Native communities who live within the region rely on its resources. But none of our communities signed that letter. None of our tribal government signed that letter. None of our elected leaders signed that letter. With no notice to the borough, in January, BLM announced that it was selecting a new preferred alternative for management of the NPRA. By adopting the no action alternative, BLM ignores the input and desires of the borough, our communities, and the people who most directly rely on the resources of the NPRA. We are talking today of legislation that would allow organizations to use environmental justice to defeat federal decisions in court. While well-intended, I fear that there will be negative, unintended consequences.
Mr.
I
Mayor,
have just watched. Yes.
Mr. Mayor, if I may, I've let people go somewhat over the witnesses, and but we're approaching 2 minutes, sir, and I hate to insist, but I think we'd like you to wrap it up as soon as possible, sir.
Well, let me just say, Chairman Grijalva, I'm grateful for you to making environmental justice a priority. I have some concerns with this legislation, but I hope that you can work we can work with you and Congressman Young and with the members of the committee to advance these important goals in a way that will be beneficial to our Alaska Native communities. Thank you for the opportunity to speak. Thank you.
And thank you for your comments, sir, and we appreciate the time and your service. Let me now, our final witness is Ms. Amy Laura Kahn, Director of Environmental Justice Clinic at the Vermont Law School. Ms. Kahn, you're recognized for 5 minutes, and thank you.
Thank you, and good morning, Chair Grijalva, Ranking Member, members of the committee, and my fellow witnesses. My name is Amy Laura Kahn, and I'm the Director of the Environmental Justice Clinic at Vermont Law School. I appreciate the opportunity to testify today. For too long, this nation has denied people of color, indigenous communities and tribal nations, and low-income communities the right to a healthy environment. Our nation has saddled environmental justice communities with the burden of proving harm, neglect, and discrimination, with little redress in the face of a mountain of evidence. Environmental racism is segregation imprinted on our landscapes. Racially discriminatory housing, land use, and transportation policies mean that environmental justice communities breathe disproportionately more air pollution. Black Americans in particular are exposed to more pollution from all major emissions sources, including waste, energy, industrial agriculture, transportation, and construction. Race remains the strongest predictor of hazardous waste siting across the US. Residents of historically Black communities contend with degraded air and water quality from landfills such as Arrowhead, a 974-acre site adjacent to Uniontown, Alabama, permitted to receive up to 15,000 tons of commercial and industrial waste per day from 33 states. And the ever-expanding Stones Throw landfill, which continues to displace Tallahassee, Alabama residents and threatens to turn this community into yet another example of Black land loss. Oil and gas and petrochemical production also disproportionately harm environmental justice communities at every stage of their life cycles. The racial disparities of the COVID-19 pandemic have laid bare just how profoundly the energy and environmental policy decisions of the past have failed communities of color, creating sacrifice zones with climate change now a threat multiplier. And environmental justice communities bear the burden of proof. For years, residents of Uniontown and Tallahassee have collected pollution data, documented health impacts, filed open records requests, marshaled turnout, filed public comments and civil rights complaints, and advanced solutions that respond to community needs, with too little response and too few available resources or remedies. Environmental protections that respond to environmental racism are scant, under-enforced, and as the last administration has shown us, easy to roll back and even easier to ignore. And environmental justice communities have not been able to depend on civil rights enforcement to fill this gap. We and members of this Congress in particular have the power to shift this burden. HR 2021 fills a longstanding gap in protections for air and water quality. Neither the Clean Air Act nor the Clean Water Act account for cumulative impacts of multiple sources or types of pollution on individual bodies and whole communities. As the EPA's Office of Inspector General stated in 2020, it is often easier for a community that has 7 facilities to get an 8th approved than for a community that has no existing facilities to get 1. The Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals recently reversed a decision by the Commonwealth of Virginia to permit the construction of a compressor station associated with the Atlantic Coast pipelining, stating that environmental justice is not merely a box to be checked. That decision relied on state law and policy, mandating analysis of disproportionate health impacts on the predominantly Black community of Union Hill. The Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, and the National Environmental Policy Act all fall short of such substantive remedies currently. HR 2021 would shift the burden onto regulators and polluters, requiring a hard look at the distribution of polluting facilities and action to prevent harm to already overburdened communities. And HR 2021 restores to communities the right to challenge environmental discrimination. In 2001, residents of Camden, New Jersey showed the power of Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 in a briefly successful challenge to a permitting process that failed to consider the impacts of a cement processing facility in an already overburdened community of color. The US Supreme Court's decision in Alexander v. Sandoval stopped that case in its tracks. barring non-federal parties from bringing disparate impact lawsuits and placing enforcement solely in the hands of federal agencies. Still, Title VI should be one of the most salient tools to remedy the harms created by environmental racism and prevent future injustice. Yet in the absence of a private right of action, longstanding deficiencies in civil rights enforcement and oversight enable recipients of federal funding to permit facilities that exacerbate racially disproportionate pollution burdens, approve transportation projects that split communities of color in half, and deny equitable participation of people of color and people with limited English proficiency in siting and permitting decisions. HR 2021 would restore to communities and the courts the power to ensure that discrimination does not occur without consequence. So doing, HR 2021 would begin to shift the burden of proof and transform how we address environmental racism and prepare for the climate crisis. Thank you so very much for the opportunity to testify.
Thank you. Let me thank all the witnesses for their thoughtful and informed testimony. Let me begin the questionings. The members are limited to 5 minutes, and let me begin myself, turn to Mr. Stauber for his questions, and we'll alternate back and forth. Let me begin. Dr. Sheets, one of the questions that one of the pushbacks on discussing Environmental Justice for All Act or the topic in general is that this is not the time, that we should leave things as is because of economy, jobs, national security, energy independence, economic growth, that all these supersede and need to be protected. And so we leave things as is for EJ communities and frontline communities, or we do nothing at all. That seems to be the tone. Can you, Dr. Sheets, some examples of economic consequences of continuing to burden environmental justice communities with the disproportionate share of our nation's pollution? Those economic consequences don't get talked about, but please, if you don't mind, sir.
Well, I think you're right, Chair Grijalva. They don't; those economic consequences are not discussed enough, and the consequences are the health consequences to the residents of people in communities of color and low-income communities. And I think that being able to breathe without developing some life-threatening disease probably trumps everything else. Because if you're not around, if you're dead, or if you're ill all the time, nothing else matters too much. And so what we've done so far, and you're talking about the associated economic consequences, is think about the pressure that ill people put on our health system and the cost of caring for these people. Even though in our communities, they tend not to have as much health care in other communities, this is still imposing costs on our society. Now, the ultimate costs are being borne by folks in these communities because they're the ones getting ill. And you know what we're saying is that these people should not be sacrificed anymore. That it's not fair and it's unconscionable. And I have to say, I don't think there's a contradiction between trying to make people healthy and trying to improve our environment and economic growth. I think if you make communities healthier, you'll find people and industry want to be in these communities more because they're good places to be. Nobody wants to be somewhere where it's hard to breathe or where the water is contaminated. And we have plenty of industry now that can come into these communities and not increase pollution, but that can improve the economic outlook of these communities and improve the economics of the entire country.
Thank you. Ms. Khan, let me ask you, the ability to take legal action on for communities where, particularly around the issue of environmental justice, was lost to the Alexander versus Sandoval Supreme Court decision back in 2001, but why is it important to restore the right to challenge disparate impact discrimination in court? How effective have federal agencies been in enforcing the prohibition against disparate impact relative to the issue of environmental justice and what the legislation attempts to address? If you could, Ms. Khan, if you could maybe speak to that point.
Of course. Dan, thank you so much. In short, federal agencies have not been responsive and not been effective in enforcing civil rights in the environmental justice context. And the barriers to that are numerous. The response time and the resolution time, these complaints have been subject historically to delay, and even requiring litigation to enforce agencies' own deadlines. Agencies and the funding recipients themselves and the communities they're mandated to protect lack guidance on civil rights compliance. And complainants are often the ones with the firsthand knowledge about the harms created by environmental discrimination have been systemically sidelined from investigation and resolutions. And then the resolutions themselves are often not enforced by the agencies who are funding recipients perpetuating discriminations. And so barriers upon barriers stand in the way of communities seeking redress from the federal agencies who are mandated to enforce Title VI.
Thank you very much. And my time has expired. Let me now recognize Mr. Stauber for 5 minutes, sir.
Well, thank you, Chair Grijalva, and thank you for the witnesses testified today. You know, first, I want to yield 30 seconds back to the chairman. I've got a question. Did you or your office send a letter to Secretary Haaland urging her to suspend work on the master development plan for the Willow Project? Mr. Chair?
I believe it was in discussion state. But if we did, it was in the context of. I believe that letter is either developed or it's already sent. But
okay, so
I know about it.
Okay, so my question then will be to Mayor Brower. Mayor Brower, in the spirit of environmental justice and consultation, were you consulted on drafting that letter? Mr. Brower, are you still with us, Mayor?
To another witness, and then we can return as soon as the good mayor's on. If you,
Yeah. My questions are to Mr. Brower. To the Natural Resources staff, is he on?
Mr. Bauer? Mr. Bauer's on available for your question, Mr. Stauber.
Oh, he is. Okay, good,
Hey,
good.
you just, Mr. Mayor, you need to unmute your equipment there so that you can respond to Mr. Stauber's questions, Mr. Mayor.
Boy, I can't wait till we can meet in person.
Yeah,
Mr. Mayor, are you on, Mr. Mayor?
Mr. Mayor, you can. Continues to be unmuted. Mr. Mayor, if you need to unmute so that we can continue.
Mr. Chair, do you have any Jeopardy music?
No, but I mean, you just earlier said that you're dying to see us in person after, I don't know if I'm ready for the full warm fuzzies, but you know, I think we'll start to,
I always enjoy full meetings with you, Mr. Chair.
Ms. Stubbard, I think the mayor's available now, if you would like to direct your question.
Great, thank you. Mayor Brower, I just want to say in the spirit of environmental justice and consultation, were you consulted on a drafting of the letter that requested the suspension of work on the master development plan for the Willow project?
No, we were not. North Slope Borough was not consulted.
So you were not consulted on a project in your community. So Mayor Brower, you sent a letter to my colleague at the end of January calling on him to meet with you and the indigenous peoples of the North Slope of Alaska before taking the position. Did that meeting take place?
No,
Have you heard anything in response to your letter?
not at this time.
Okay. Can you describe how the Willow project will build on the economic development in your district?
Yes, the benefits would be numerous to the income that would be generated from this project, and it lists the items that I mentioned earlier in my comments in regards to the health and
Would it,
health communities and the fire departments, the search and rescue that are within the North Slope Borough. Those kind of benefits would be identified through the needs of the North Slope Borough.
so in your testimony, would it be correct that you said 95% of your investments in your community are paid through the taxes of the oil and gas industry?
Yes, you're right.
Okay. And what would you say to those who claim to support native consultation, but pick and choose which projects to consult on and which people to be consulted?
You know, that's in regards to consultation, we made our attempts to invite the leaders of the administration, Biden administration, to no results. We made attempts to identify with the potential processes that need to be identified with what or not.
Right. So I want to be clear. So you are the mayor of the community in which the Willow project will be put forward. And in the spirit of environmental justice and consultation, you as the community leader will never consulted on the project, on the master development plan for the Willow project. Mr. Chair, this is very concerning when we have folks coming up talking about environmental justice and consultation, and you have a community that was never consulted on the master development plan for the Willow project. Very concerning. So I think it's kind of hypocritical that you can pick and choose who you consult with, and it's disappointing. Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Stubbard. There's no inconsistency in that letter and the members that sign it, none whatsoever with this hearing. What the reinforcement is to reinforce the National Environmental Policy Act, NEPA, and the Endangered Species Act, and the public process attended to that. This was flawed from the beginning. To disclose the true impacts that we're asking the Interior Department to do is only a legitimate thing. You know,
Mr. Chair, would you
one of
yield?
the things that the community that you are referencing, sir, under NEPA is fully uh,
The
has
mayor
the
just
full
said,
opportunity to be involved in that. So this right of disclosure, this right of everybody knowing, and this right of taking a flawed process and saying this is the opportunity to correct
Point
that
of order,
and do it
Mr.
right.
Chairman. Mr.
That-
Chairman, a
there's
point
no
of order.
inconsistency.
How much time is the chairman speaking?
And the approval of a flawed process by anybody still does not take the importance of having full disclosure and a NEPA process. That's only
Point
fair.
of order. Sublime
Chair,
point of order.
may I respond, Mr.
Yes.
Chair?
Of course, the
Order, Chairman Grijalva. Can we move on, please?
The
It's
mayor of
doing
the
the-
community has said he wasn't consulted. The mayor of the community in question, where the Willow project will be taking place and the investments in the community was never consulted. That was
letter.
my point of questioning. Never consulted. And I yield back.
Thank you very much, and back and forth, and let me now recognize Mr. Napolitano for 5 minutes.
Thank you,
Representative, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. To Ms. Laura Cortez, I'm close to East LA, but can you speak more to the drinking water studies that your organization has led with members of the community?
Sure, thank you. Yeah, so with our community, one of the big issues or things that I've learned with water quality, because I'm also a community member who was completely unaware of some of the water issues happening in our hoods. And so education is a big, big issue, starting with the idea of understanding where your water comes from, how water is exploited from other areas and taken. A lot of times those are indigenous communities whose water we are taking. So those are things that we learn together, and then understanding our water reports in terms of our water quality. So water reports, unsure if any of y'all look at your water reports, but they're very technical, very complex. And that's something that we learn as a community, want to understand the pollutants, the thresholds, how our notice is given. Every city, every water company is completely different, which creates a lot of complication in terms of being able to understand when there are issues and therefore advocate for improved water quality. How can we advocate for something that the system is created so we do not understand it? And so with that, we've been able to make collaborations with universities to be able to take community members to understand the process of what contaminants are in water, how they have health impacts, how we can start advocating to that. Is that the jurisdiction of a water company? Is that the jurisdiction that is a regional municipality, right? So we need to understand these different agencies, these different pollutants, these different health impacts. And so that's something that we continue to work on with our community members from East LA down. We recently, I know there was a recent policy that passed on PFAS, right? Looking at some of our contaminants there, but there are so many, including lead, including mercury, including nickel, that are in our water that we need to continue to address.
Thank you very much. I think you're doing well, but I think we need to talk, Ms. Cortez. I am much versed on water, and I'm sure that the water companies maybe need to have more information disseminated to the general public they serve, because it behooves them. Dr. Sheets, today, too many environmental justice communities, especially tribal, live without safe and reliable water supplies and basic water infrastructure. One of the barriers that has led to this historic inequity is the federal funding. And can recent investments past maybe remedy or try to remedy some of these issues?
Yes, well, thank you for the question. I'm not an expert on water issues, but let me say this. I think that the Biden administration's initiative, Justice 40 initiative, really holds out some hope that benefits and investments leading to benefits will flow to communities to address all types of issues, including the water issue that you bring up. So hopefully, when this initiative is fully developed and implemented, communities that are suffering from a lack of water quality or access to water will be helped through it.
Well, there's too many things that have bothered all of us that in the past we've ignored, such as all the illnesses that are born in water and the air. And I think the environmental justice community has the right to bring them to fore so that we can try to prevent them or remedy them with the pollutants and make sure that our communities are safe and safeguarded. Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Lady yields. Let me now turn to The Dean of the House, Mr. Young, you're recognized, sir.
Mr. Chairman, thank you, and I hope you understand it is awfully early in the morning for the mayor and myself. You guys have a nice leisure morning, and we have to be up at 4 o'clock to have this hearing. I want to remind you of that. There's a little bit of difference when we have these Zoom meetings, but thank you for having the hearing, and thank Mr. Mayor, thank you for being here and testimony. I think it's crucially important to recognize that there is a pick and choose by certain people within the Congress when you take a list to one side and won't listen to the other side, yet you need to say you have consultation. And for that, my opposite side of this, there is no consultation. The people in the area, especially the Willow Project and the North Slope. And Warren said, there is no consultation, Mr. Chairman, all due respect. Send a letter, big deal. You haven't sat down and talked to anybody. You haven't had a meeting with anybody. They've asked for meetings, and I'm suggesting respectfully, if we're gonna do this correctly, make sure you consult with everyone. There are indigenous people that are directly affected by action of the Congress. I think that's very important. Mr. Mayor, just out of curiosity, how much money do you think you've received and what have you used it for from the industry itself? How has it affected your society up there?
Thank you, Congressman Young, with your concurrence, Mr. Ramaldi. It's near the 400 million, and that's what we are based on the taxes that we receive from the industry, and it's subject to the borough's operations.
Now, you've used it for water. We just heard about water, drinking portable water.
Yes.
You've used it for waste. You've used it for education. You've done everything right with the money. And yet people will say, oh, we're going to help the poor, the indigenous people, yet they don't want you to receive the money. This is what I don't understand. There's such hypocrisy here. There is no justice in this. And so I do believe you've used the money correctly. I go there. I know what I'm talking about. And I've seen the improvement over the times when I first went there back in the early 60s. You didn't have a whole lot. You did have natural gas, which was good, but I do believe you handled this well. And you still halfway on a subsistence livelihood. You're a whaling captain, are you not, Mr. Mayor?
Yes, I am, Congressman. Thank you.
Did you have a strike this year?
Yes, we landed the fall well.
Good. That sounds good. Well, anyway, Mr. Chairman, I understand these hearings. I just wish everybody would play on a level playing field. If we're going to talk about consultation and justice, even though you may disagree with them, you have to consult with them. That's the fairness doctrine. That goes with the whole Congress. And if we're going to deal with people in indigenous rank, don't pat them on the head and say we're going to take care of you and then take it away from them. That's wrong. With that, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Young, and we will have that opportunity, sir. And I take your recommendation seriously. We'll have that opportunity when we talk about the Respect Act and all its ramifications, and to the topic that we're talking about today. So I appreciate your comments and look forward to that discussion in the very near future. Let me now turn to Mr. Cohen, Representative. You are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and any members of the committee that yielded to me, because I've got a packed day, and I'm sure everybody else does too, but it's a packed day, including a funeral, so it's a busy, busy, packed day. I want to thank you for having this hearing on this important subject, and it's something that strikes close to my heart and to my communities. We have several African-American inner city communities that have been the site of much industrial pollution and industrial development over the years. Recently, there was an attempt to put a pipeline from an oil company.
Mr. Chair, excuse me, Mr. Chair, somebody has to mute. Somebody is interrupting our speaker.
I think it's the mayor. If somebody would communicate that we can, I have to ask him to unmute this time. And so if somebody would advise the mayor to unmute, I would appreciate that. Mr. Cohen, please continue.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Stauber, for making note of that. They tried to put a pipeline through a minority community, and they had the nerve to say it was the path of least resistance. The least resistance because the poor community, which happens to be African American, which had been used for so many years as places where industrial sites located that were put off lots of pollutants, and those communities had 4 times the cancer rates of any place else in the city. They hadn't had the voices to stand up. This year, in what was an historic moment with grassroots support, plus Vice President Gore, who got involved, and my office and others, the pipeline did not go through. It was stopped. And that was wonderful, but normally that doesn't happen. And industrial pollutants go to the places of least resistance, just like it was said in that situation. There was a senator I served with, a Republican senator in Tennessee, state senator named Leonard Donovan, fine gentleman. And he used to say, he told me, which is nothing unique, the NIMBY statement, not in my backyard. And that's what I learned. In every place, they don't want it in their backyard. And the powerful people, the wealthy people, the people that have voices because of political contributions or other powers that they might have to extend benefits and on elected officials, either during or after office, they don't get the pollutants in those areas in their neighborhoods because they've got a stronger voice. And it's gone on forever. And so we need to have this environmental justice for the future and to make up somewhat for the past. And so I appreciate this hearing. Let me ask first here, Dr. Sheets, and I appreciated your testimony. The Byhalia pipeline was a prime example of cumulative impact. Were this to be built, communities were already at greater health risk would have had one more potential source of pollutants. How would this bill have affected the cumulative impact of projects?
Well, I think that I think it would be subjected to a cumulative impacts review, application for the permit, and if that review showed that the standard is if due to cumulative impacts, standard in the EJ for All Act is that if due to cumulative impacts there is not a reasonable certainty of no harm to the community in which facility a pipeline would go through. If there's not a reasonable certainty of no harm, then the application would be denied. So there's a level of protection there through cumulative impact analysis.
And have you seen a history of plants that emit pollutants, oil or either other industrial type, being put in minority communities, both white and black, throughout this country?
Well, there is, and that's the studies I referred to. Yes, there's a history of all types of polluting facilities being disproportionately cited in communities of color, and not just poor communities of color, in communities of color and low-income communities of all colors, so including low-income white communities. There's a history of that.
Thank you, sir. Ms. Khan, you're an expert on environmental justice in the context of civil rights law. Can you provide a real-world example of how the current application of the Civil Rights Act of '64 under the Supreme Court's Sandoval decision does not fully protect the rights of communities suffering from discrimination?
Yes, thank you for this opportunity. In 43 seconds, I spoke of the communities in Uniontown and Tallahassee, Alabama, in particular, both of whom have gone on more than one occasion to the EPA filing civil rights complaints about the disproportionate impact of the siting of those landfills on those historically Black communities. In particular, the Uniontown landfill holds 4 million tons of coal ash that actually were carted in from a disaster outside of the state and is now impacting that community in a negative way, along with a cheese plant, a catfish plant, and a whole host of issues related to insufficient water and sanitation services. And so the community itself is dealing with its own set of cumulative impacts and has failed to get redress from EPA by filing complaints.
Thank you, Ms. Khan. Thank you, all the members of the committee that allowed me to go a little early. We'll submit the remainder of our questions in writing. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Appreciate it, Mr. Cohen. Thank you. Let me now recognize Representative McClintock, sir. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, I have to admit that I joined this hearing largely out of curiosity over how the leftist majority can turn anything, even natural resources policy, into a racial issue. the fact is, the American people of all races and ethnicities and religions and origins have suffered severely over the last year because of leftist policies that are driving the most alarming increase in crime and homelessness wherever they've taken control. Reckless spending that's driving the worst inflation Americans have suffered in 40 years. A mass migration across our borders that threatens the prosperity and the social services and the safety of every community in our country. And when it comes to the subject matter of this committee, their foolish policies have also done enormous damage to the quality of life of Americans when it comes to resources policy. Think about this. The first day that the left took control of the White House, Mr. Biden canceled the Keystone Pipeline. That threw thousands of workers into unemployment. It denied the American economy some 600,000 barrels of crude oil a day coming into American energy markets. He ordered a halt to oil and gas leases on federal land. He suspended oil drilling leases in Alaska. You know, in the last years of the Trump administration, we had achieved something that all of us thought was impossible during most of our lifetimes. We had achieved American energy independence, including some of the lowest energy prices in decades. The Democrats managed to reverse that achievement in a matter of months. Oil prices increased 69% last year, gasoline prices up nearly 40%. And this bill would add still more costs to American energy production, ultimately paid by Americans at the gas pump and in their skyrocketing utility bills. In his opening statement, Mr. Stauber complained that local gasoline is going for, I believe he said, $3.66 a gallon. I would invite him to come here to California, where leftist policies have already pushed the average gasoline price across California today to $4.70 a gallon. I might also touch on the toll on our forests here in the Sierra Nevada. It's been taken by years of leftist environmental prohibitions on forest management, prohibitions that have resulted in catastrophic overgrowth of our forests. The price of lumber hit an all-time high in May of last year. That drives higher housing costs, while our federal forests are effectively abandoned to neglect and catastrophic fire. Meanwhile, America's become the second largest importer of soft pulp lumber in the world, including $4.5 billion of imported lumber from Canada, while our forests sit idle. These conditions are the stark and unmistakable effect of the resources policies that the left has imposed on our economy. The suffering they impose affect every race, every community, and every family in our country, but none suffer the resulting increases in energy prices, housing prices, and transport prices more than the poor, regardless of their race or where they happen to live. I would suggest that maybe, just maybe, we ought to be focusing on these policies before they do more harm to every American of every race. But as this hearing makes crystal clear, the Democrats seem to be incapable of doing so because they're unable to see beyond a person's race. How sad. How sad for them, and how sad for our country. I yield back.
The gentleman yields. I would agree with Mr. McClintock. I think that the issue of race and economic status should not be a criteria for having to legislate. But when it is a factor in how decisions are made, and we need to correct that imbalance and make it not about race again, that's where I think legislation like the one before us, Mr. McClintock, has to play a role, because the harmful decisions involve race, and the corrective action involves a protection so that it is not about race. But having said that, let me yield to you, sir, because I took time and that's not fair. Mr. McClintock?
Well, I have nothing more to say, Mr. Chairman. The facts speak for themselves very clearly, and the American people can see that very clearly. They're feeling it every day as they go to the gas station, as they pay their utility bills, as they search for affordable housing. These policies are driving terrible suffering across the land. Please stop it.
Thank you, Mr. McClintock. On that note, let me now turn to the gentleman from California, Mr. Costa. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for holding this hearing. I think it's important. I'd like to focus on two areas, on water and rural areas in America, and I'll draw as an example my home, where I've lived all my life and grown up out on a farm and dependent upon well water for our supply. Senator Padilla and I worked very hard on the bipartisan infrastructure package to ensure that we had money for clean drinking water. We've got communities like All Paw and Fairmead. They're not towns, but they don't have the wherewithal, the resources to implement the level of clean drinking water that they need and deserve. There are other many communities that make up the valley that have similar situations. Small towns like Dos Palace, we are helping them with USDA in the state, and they have a little better situation. But how do you see communities throughout rural America benefiting from with the great social and economic disparities from this $52 billion for clean drinking water? And I don't know if Laura Cortez, you would like to speak to that, or Laura Khan.
Yeah, I can share briefly. Thank you for that question, Representative. I think I do not live in a rural area. So I will start there, and I do not know your lived reality, so I'm learning a lot, and I appreciate that. I think one of the opportunities that I see that I think doesn't get highlighted enough during this hearing so far, um, is the idea of we are opening doors for alternative and sustainable energy, right? That is the idea when we're talking about a just and fair transition. And so when we talk about that, rural areas, I hope, right, can look at different areas of exploring more sustainable, healthier ways to do this work. I think of, although this is not directly related to
Well,
water.
right,
Oh,
but you're talking
yes,
about energy, and I appreciate that, but I'm talking about water here. I want to defer to the
sure.
chairman, but let me just make a personal comment. Just as important as clean drinking water is to these rural communities, as is a water supply for these rural communities that produce food. I've had significant drought conditions right now and in the past, where we've had 30–40%, as much as half the communities unemployed because a zero water allocation. And water is critical to our production of food. It's a national security issue. And I think that needs to be taken into account, the same in terms of the economic and social disparities that occur. Mr. Chairman, I'll defer and allow you to balance of my 2 minutes.
Thank you very much. Dr. Sheets, a couple of just follow up on some things. Do you think EJ communities might benefit if the federal agencies that did NEPA reviews for federally permitted or funded projects that are currently right now exempt from that NEPA review? Would that be a benefit to include those for EJ communities? And I think the corollary question is if federal agents were directed to choose a course of action under NEPA that avoids further harm to overburden EJ communities. Those are currently not part of that process, and I'm just going to ask you to your reaction to that.
I think communities would benefit if they could weigh in on infrastructure decisions that currently, which they cannot weigh in on. After all, you're talking about structures or activities that will be in their communities for decades and have an impact on their communities. So certainly they should be allowed to voice their opinion on these type of projects. And I think the whole process would be better. The projects would be better if they are allowed to weigh in, because they know their communities best. They know what will impact their communities the most, so they can make the best suggestions on how to mitigate any harms that a project might cause.
Yeah, and a question, Ms. Cortez, you know, one of the things that you've heard at the hearing and we hear all the time is that, we hear that refrain that stronger environmental protections for all communities are gonna kill jobs, they're gonna inflict economic harm. Uh, Is that a choice we have? The choice being economic prosperity, uh, and continuing to burden EJ communities with higher share of our nation's pollution and the damaging public health effects by that. Uh, How do you respond to that refrain?
Yeah. Yeah, I think it is really narrow-minded to really think about jobs only, particularly when we are working those jobs also, right? So it's really important to note that in my community, as an example, we have folks who are truck drivers, who are port workers, who do work in these refineries, who are our families and our neighbors who are having the health issues, but are having, and most of them understand that, right? But risk that because of a job, right? And in talking to these folks, it is very clearly understood that if there was an alternative, that we would love to transition to that alternative,
Thank
right?
you
And
very
so,
much.
yes, thank you.
Yeah, I'm running out of time and I apologize. I don't know if we're gonna have a second round or not. It depends on the will of the committee, but let me now turn to, gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Graves, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank the witnesses for joining today. Ms. Cortez, I appreciate your testimony about the NEPA process and the documents being 5,000 pages in some cases, and that just not being helpful because nobody has the time or expertise to sit around and read that type of documentation. Do you think that results in a better outcome for the environment when you have documents like that effectively serve as an impediment for public participation or understanding?
Yeah, thank you for that question. One of the big issues is not that the document is so big because we think the studies are needed, but that they're difficult to understand, that there is no support to be able to analyze these things with community. And oftentimes in my community, they're done as a checkbox. It's done, put it out, 30 days, close it up, with no expectation or outreach to community to be able to really understand and weigh in on that analysis.
Thank you. Thank you. And look, I agree with you that I think that the NEPA process is very difficult to participate in and digest, and we actually have legislation trying to help to fix that. Ms. Khan, there was your testimony points to NAACP documents, fumes across the fence line, and it says that more than 1 million people live within 1/2 mile of natural gas facilities. Can you provide a little more context for the statistic, and what is that, sort of in relation to the overall population living within that radius?
Oh, thank you for that question. I appreciate it. And I would say as a starting point, I think the study stands for itself. I think that, but I'm happy to supply a written response that puts that
Okay,
statistics
I'd
more
appreciate
in
that, Ms.
context.
Khan, and I'd like to put a little bit more detail in there because I think
Sure.
that it potentially was a bit misleading. Nationally, about 2% of the population living within a 1/2 mile of all the gas facilities are African American. In my home state of Louisiana, it's about 5%. So I think it's important to put that in context because, and Mr. Chairman, I got to tell you, this is once again been incredibly disappointed by sort of the disposition of this hearing, that everything is being done because folks are intentionally trying to discriminate against a certain population. I don't buy it. I haven't done the math. I'm going to take a quick guess that I'm in the top 3 of every single person on this Zoom right now, WebEx right now, that have a higher number or percentage of African Americans living from a mile away from where I live. I will bet you that I have more oil and gas and chemical facilities within a few miles from my house than anybody else here. I don't believe that I'm being discriminated against. There's somebody talking earlier about Virginia and 6 to 7 facilities. It's easier to permit another one. Let me tell you why there's so many facilities where I live. I'm at the bottom of the Mississippi River. It is one of the easiest ways, the safest ways to transport goods. And so people want to be by the river. That's why they're here. We also have a lot of the raw materials and resources and energy supplies. That's why they're here. It's not an intent to discriminate against certain people. If we want to talk about discrimination, let's do that, Mr. Chairman. My home state of Louisiana, we've lost 2,000 square miles of our coast. And as the last hearing I participated in, you had somebody try and come in and say that offshore oil and gas production was discriminatory when the facts showed that the closest community, Grand Isle, was 0.9% African American, 0.9. People come and make up all this stuff about racism, yet we've lost 2,000 square miles of our coast. And this committee, in fact, Mr. Chairman, you yourself, along with all of the other Democrats on the committee, have opposed efforts to try to protect these communities. Is that discrimination because we're Cajun? I don't understand. And I think it is a total disservice for all of you to be here suggesting that all of this is being done intentionally because folks are racist. I don't believe that. I don't. And I don't think it's good for our country to keep driving this wedge. There are problems. Yes. There are environmental problems. Absolutely. There are racial problems. There are economic problems. Let's just be candid and address those and stop all of this driving divisiveness in this country and in this committee and trying to force people to believe that they're discriminated against. Like I said, I've got more chemical and oil and gas plants within a few miles of my house than any of you. And I'm not out here yelling about discrimination. There's a fit there. I chose to live here. Mr. Chairman, I'm going to follow up with a number of QFR's questions for the record, but I think it's just dangerous trajectory for us to continue to force this conspiracy of racism on all of these decisions. It's not going to yield results. Let's work on things that will actually solve problems for communities of color, for economically distressed communities and others, and stop voting against trying to protect and sustain the people that we represent in South Louisiana, like you have all done. It's just disingenuous to hear you sit here and act like there's suddenly problems for other communities. I yield back.
Gentleman yields. Let me now turn to the original co-sponsor of this legislation and a partner for about 2 years plus in bringing this legislation together through a long process. I'm going to, with the indulgence of others and as chair, I'm going to extend Mr. McEachin's time as I recognize him so that and if there is a concern, we can balance that extension to the other side at any point. Let me now recognize Mr. McEachin, representative. You're recognized for, I won't give you the magic minute, but at least 10 minutes, I guess.
I'll try not to use it all the time. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the committee's indulgence, and I appreciate the opportunity to have worked with you these past few years on this very important legislation. I'll say to the previous speaker that he hit the nose right on the he hit the nail right on the head. He chooses to live where he lives. He has the resources to move or not move. In many cases, individuals who are in EJ communities don't have those resources, don't have those opportunities, don't have those choices. And that's the concern we have. And look, whether he wants to believe it's intentional or not intentional, we don't have to delve into that debate. What is these communities exist. They are uniform in that they are discriminated against from the standpoint that they are disenfranchised, poor, indigenous, brown, or African American. Now, again, whether it's intentional or not is not the point. The point is what are we going to do as a country, as a nation, to lift these communities up, to empower them to fix their problems, and to move our country forward. And so with that, Mr. Chairman, I thank you for the opportunity to have worked with you. I have to tell you that when I was listening to the ranking member say all the bad things about our legislation, I kept waiting for him to introduce his legislation that would help this problem. He seems to acknowledge the problem, but yet and still he doesn't seem to want to put forth an amendment or his own piece of legislation to fix this problem. And I find that discouraging, to say the least. Mr. Chairman, I'd like to start off with, I hope I'm pronouncing your last name correctly, Ms. Khan at the Vermont Law School. You have a clinic, I believe, and you've had a case in that clinic called CARE versus EPA. Can you just briefly tell us about that? Because I have a question about that case. Just tell us a little bit about what that case is about, please.
Absolutely. That case was brought by Earth Justice and first the Yale Law Clinic and then the Vermont Law School Environmental Justice Clinic on behalf of communities in Flint, Michigan, in Tallahassee, Alabama, in New Mexico, California, Texas, and also on behalf of the National Sierra Club. And that case was a case of the undue delay by EPA in responding to Title VI complaints filed with EPA asking them to enforce the civil rights obligations of their funding recipients. And these complaints languished all for over a decade in spite of EPA's own regulations setting strict timelines for response and resolution of those complaints.
So let me ask you this. You know, one of the great complaints that the other side seems to have about this legislation is that it will encourage litigation, you know, the same old song and dance. I want to ask you, how could greater enforcement of the civil rights provisions under the EJ for All Act have prevented this court case?
Well, this was actually the second case raising this question of undue delay. So in terms of the sort of judicial inefficiency and kind of and drawing this out and the cost, had EPA followed its own regulations from the outset and been responsive and continued to address its backlog of complaints and address them directly in collaboration with the complainants themselves, responding to community needs, litigation and two lawsuits would have not have been necessary.
Interesting. I thank you for that. Dr. Sheets, let me turn to you now, sir. And first of all, thank you for the honor of having worked with you over these past couple of years on this legislation. Your expertise has been foundational to this bill. You know, the COVID-19 pandemic has highlighted so many health disparities in the United States. Can you explain how cumulative pollution, the burden of cumulative pollution, may have led to some of the healthcare disparities that we've seen throughout the pandemic?
Yes, thanks for the question, Representative McKeechin. Good to see you again. I think I may not have time to say it fully, but I think COVID-19 is an example of what we're talking about with cumulative impacts. The EJ community said for a while that our communities, the EJ communities, are vulnerable to environmental and health threats that are coming to our country. And with COVID-19, you see that air pollution increases the death rate, and we see that it has been tied to race, that there are higher death rates in communities of color and low-income communities due to COVID. So when I gave the definition of cumulative impacts, you see here both parts of it: the pollution, the connection to air pollution, and the connection to social vulnerabilities in our society. COVID-19 unfortunately demonstrates both of those and demonstrates cumulative impacts.
Thank you for your answer. Can you take a moment, if you can, and illustrate how taking into account the cumulative impacts and permitting decisions would impact our communities, that is, our EJ communities?
Well, I think right now, one of the main problems is you don't take into account pollution. So you don't take into account pollution across different types of pollutant. You have the individual standard, and if that standard is not violated, then the permit goes forward. But it's not taking into account the mixture of pollution in our communities. And when you breathe in air, you don't just breathe in one pollutant. It goes to a partition in your lungs. It all mixes in your lungs and can have detrimental health impacts. But the laws and regulations don't take into account that total super pollution that exists in the neighborhood. And so cumulative impact analysis would and should take that into account.
Thank you, sir. And finally, I'll turn to Ms. Cortez and just ask you, ma'am, in thinking about NEPA, how would the EJ for All Act help shift and enhance public engagement, ma'am?
Yeah, being able to have longer periods for community engagement and intentional community engagement, which is what this policy outlines, is critical and will be critical to making sure that it's not just a check off on the list, making sure that community is fully aware of what's happening. The rest of the work we learn how to do. Unfortunately, we are very fortunately and unfortunately we are super adaptable. So for example, at Eastern, we have community committees who do not have technical expertise, who learn to read EIRs, who learn how to put public comments, who learn how to put written comments together for the record. We can do that work. It is very possible. It is just very difficult to do within a very short timeline and without ensuring that everything is also included in these impacts, right? Because when we're just looking at one impact or another, then that also doesn't benefit us when we are experiencing a very different reality than what is stated in this document. So there are a few ways in terms of outreach, engagement, timing that NEPA would support, or this policy would support with NEPA.
Thank you, ma'am. Mr. Chairman, I appreciate your indulgence as well as the indulgence of the committee. I apologize for trespassing on your time, and I yield back.
Always a gentleman, Mr. McEachin, but this is your work as well, and I want to thank you for that. Let me now recognize gentlelady, Ms. Radawagon. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Kalo Palaba. I want to thank you, Mr. Chairman, and the ranking member for holding this important hearing on this very important legislation. At this time, I would like to yield to ranking member Stauber. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
There you go. Thank you very much. I want to, if I may, I want to just talk a little bit about what Congressman Young had spoke about earlier, about the importance of getting all people involved, whether you agree with their position or not. The Willow Project, this mayor stated he wasn't consulted. And I think he wasn't consulted, as Congressman Young rightfully said, was the position wasn't in line with some of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle. It makes the hypocrisy here on this particular project is astounding. Because of not having consultation, the management plan, suspend the management plan put forward on the Willow project. 95% of the monies going into this community come from revenues from oil and gas. Where else are they going to get that? And these are able-bodied workers wanting to work, wanting to live where they live. And there's no consultation because the folks that are intending to do it don't support the project, or rather don't support the community. The community has stated they want this project to go forward the right way. But if there's no consultation, Mr. Chair, it's a hypocrisy. For me, we talk about economic justice. What about for these communities and the good paying jobs that are going to come there with the best environmental standards? What about the investment that these levies and taxes bring to the community? 95% of this community's revenues are because of the oil and gas industry. And the mayor has stated to all of us, they want to be a part. They want this project to go forward. And yet they're not consulted. I think the hypocrisy here, we brought it up enough. I think it's shown outright, and it's unacceptable. Economic justice, as my good friend from Louisiana just said. What about his constituents? How about allowing them to have good paying jobs? And yes, I'll bring it right back to mining. You talk about economic justice and breathing air. We mine in Minnesota the cleanest, best environmental standards and best labor standards. Yet members of this community won't let us mine in northern Minnesota, the biggest copper nickel find in North America. Yet they're okay with buying Chinese minerals mined by child slave labor to this country. Where's the economic justice there? Where's the economic justice for my constituents in northeastern Minnesota to mine these products, strategic national security minerals? Yet my colleagues on this, many of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle on this committee refuse to acknowledge we have an opportunity to do it right. And one of the witnesses, the gentleman said, we all breathe this air. Absolutely. So is it okay to allow China to pollute our air and then still buy these critical minerals from them? The answer is no. The gentleman is right. The jet stream carries that stuff across the world, yet we're allowing it to happen. We have every single member of this community, when I had a resolution that said the United States will not buy minerals from foreign countries where the critical minerals have been mined by child slave labor. Every single member of the Democratic side on this committee voted against it. I never thought child slave labor was a partisan issue. I think we have an opportunity here to do what's right. And economic justice means justice for those members who live in the community, and they ought to be consulted. And I yield back.
Gentleman yields. Let me recognize Mr. Sablon, sir. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing. And I like to say welcome to our witness. I know the Dean of the House told the committee earlier that it was a little early in Alaska where he was, I think it was, but this hearing started at 1 in the morning, Mr. Chairman, and I have another hearing following. But let me ask a question, and this just may get me in trouble, but let me just think out loud and ask Ms. Cortez and Ms. Khan to please, can you tell me if the commodity water is part of the environmental justice agenda, I guess, since water over time has been taken, it's a public commodity. It's water, groundwater, it's a public commodity, and yet water continues to be converted into a private commodity. They take water out from the ground and put it in a bottle and sell it to us. So, Ms. Curtis, in as short a time as you can, please give me some ideas of your thoughts. Give me some of your thoughts on this issue.
Yeah, thank you for that. Oh, go ahead.
No, go ahead, please.
Yes.
Water.
Yeah, with water, I think so for us at Eastern, we definitely are working on water from an education and policy beginning perspective. We fully believe that appropriating water is not sustainable. We cannot continue to steal water. And so it is really important that we learn to conserve water. So some of the things that we're doing is making sure that we're investing education and also support letters and anything else we can do to make sure that we are retaining as much water that we can from different sources, including like rainwater. We have a big project actually that's less than a block from my house that's like a 100,000 gallon, huge gallon situation under a park to conserve water. And so these are the types of efforts that we know that we need to be able to not focus on stealing water from other areas, which
All
is
right, thank you. Thank you. Ms. Khan, can you tell me about this situation where we give people permission to go out, dig a well, suck out all the water that a whole community needs and uses, and then package that into, this kind of bottles, and then sell it right back to the community, and in the end, leave poison out there. Is this an issue that we should all be looking at?
This is absolutely the issue of of water rights, and clean drinking water and access to clean drinking water is absolutely an issue of environmental justice and environmental racism. And, you know, I would say I think about water as part of the public trust.
Okay.
You know, water is part of our public trust that we need to be conserving and ensuring is that communities have equitable access to. And the privatization causes enormous concern. And then if you layer on top of that the denial of access to clean drinking water for communities like Flint, or the one of the one intentional discrimination case we know, the Holt case in Tennessee, where a white community was given access to clean water and the Black community was explicitly denied. You know, those are situations in which the only option becomes buying water and relying on, you know, private resources, and the cost to that is insurmountable. So I think absolutely it's an issue of environmental justice.
My time is up. Ms. Khan, just one question again. The insular areas, the United States insular areas, sometimes called outlying areas, territories, you know, including my district, the Northern Mariana Islands, have long borne the brunt of the most damaging effects of climate change. And yet our natural resources have been underfunded, overexploited for a long time. How does chronic underfunding in the insular areas and environmental justice communities make these commodities more susceptible to climate change impacts?
Well, I think this is all rooted in historic disinvestment, and which layers on top of you know, burdens on top of burdens. And I think about in particular maybe a slightly different community, but in a community that I know quite well in Eastwick in Philadelphia, which took federal resources to displace about 8,000 people from 2,300 acres of land. And built an urban renewal community on top of the floodplain. That community is now dealing with chronic stormwater issues, catastrophic flooding, and is adjacent to a Superfund site. While over many, many years, that community was both disinvested and disenfranchised from the decisions that affected residents' lives. So all of these things come together to make communities more vulnerable.
All right, thank you, Ms. Khan. Chairman Grijalva, thank you for this hearing. I need to run off to another hearing, but I appreciate that you.
1 o'clock
holding
this Mr. Sablan.
Yeah, this is how loyal I am to the chairman of the Natural Resources Committee.
Please allow me to thank you. You know, I don't feel anywhere the guilt that I should feel now for my good friend from Alaska, given the torture that we put you through. Thank you very much, Mr. Sablan.
Don't feel guilty. I enjoy being in this committee. Thank you very much, and everyone have a good morning.
Let me now recognize the Representative Tiffany for 5 minutes, sir.
Thank you, Chair Grijalva. I appreciate it very much. Mayor Brower, I'm going to have a question for you in about 2 minutes. But first of all, Mr. Sheets, I just have a couple quick questions. Have there been improvements in emissions that have been done over the last few decades into the environment, into America?
There have been improvements, but there are also areas where there are multiple sources of pollution where we need to improve further.
Do you think, so just for the record, sulfur dioxide, nitrous oxide, many of those pollutants like that are down like 80, 90%. So we've really, we should also recognize the improvements. There's further to go, but we should recognize those improvements. Should we recognize in cumulative impacts? So the life expectancy of an American back at the turn of the century in 1900 was about low 50, in the low 50s, and 1 in 10 children died as babies. And should we consider the improvements that we've made when discussing cumulative impacts?
Well, I think you have to consider. I think you have to consider the disparities, and I think even though we have made improvements, I think all of us would say that it's still unfair. Is that some people don't live as long as other people?
Do you personally have an objection to the North Slope drilling for oil, that local community we've been hearing from Mayor Brower?
I don't know that case at all, so I'm not going to comment on that.
Ms. Khan, so we've been hearing about how a number of the very rich environmental NGOs have been taking foreign money. Does your organization take any money from foreign interests?
I work for the Vermont Law School, and to be perfectly honest, I would have to consult with the administration to understand the larger funding landscape. But I'm happily able to supply a written response.
Oh, that would be terrific. So that's all publicly available information, I take it. Is that right?
As I actually would have to consult with the administration and supply you with a written response.
That'd be terrific. Mayor Brower, I hope we have you aboard here. You commented earlier about outside groups speaking for your tribe in northern Alaska. Could you expound on that a little bit more? What was going on there?
Well, thank you for the questioning, Mayor Brown. I hope you can hear me. So there's, in my comments, I indicated we have not had any consultation, but there have been other groups of people trying to speak for our region to indicate that they were in opposition to the activity in regards to Willow and oil and gas operations on the North Slope.
And Mayor, do you believe that they received that their voices were heard and yours was not by the federal government?
It really reflects that, sir. It's that we've had very little consultation, if any at all. You know, there was comments and staff folks that came to that from Alaska to discuss subject matter, but then there was no real determination one way or the other.
Mayor, thank you so much for joining us today. I appreciate those answers. So let's sum this up here. Here we have an effort to take away local control, and we have wealthy environmental groups that want to advance the green fantasy on America, where we're only going to run on windmills and solar panels when we should have it all of the above approach in terms of producing energy. So we're taking away local control here from this tribe in northern Alaska. We're not considering cumulative impacts, including improvements that we have made as Americans. Can we do better? Can there be improvements? Absolutely. But we should also recognize where we came from and those things that we're doing better. And to me, there are no boutique slices of justice. Calling it environmental justice. I mean, should we have economic justice, food justice, recreational justice? What other types of justice should we have? In America, there is only justice. And it's really unfortunate that we see this trying to divide Americans based on something like this, rather than us all working together. And finally, I'd say here in northern Wisconsin, people of all socioeconomic backgrounds, including the poor, they're paying twice as much for their energy this year. They're paying twice as much to fill their propane tank. They're paying significantly more for their natural gas bill if that's what they're heating with. That's what's happening. And this committee is taking us down that road. How can there be justice, including if you subscribe to this notion of environmental justice, if poor people have to pay more for their energy costs and they can't spend it on other things that are more important to them, like their children, their health care, or whatever the case may be? I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields. Let me now, I believe it's Ms. DeGette, recognize Ms. McCallum, sorry. You recognize 5 minutes, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I look forward to hearing from the gentlewoman from Colorado as well. Thank you for holding this hearing. Representative McEachin, thank you for your work on this issue. The Environmental for Justice Act will take critical steps to address disproportionate environmental and public health issues in low-income communities and communities of color. Environmental justice, for me though, doesn't mean just correcting those exposures to toxic pollution that the communities face. E&J communities also lack equitable resources to positively change their conditions and improve opportunities to invest in their future. Nationwide, the poorest communities have 41% less tree cover. Yeah, I'm going to talk about trees for a minute than the wealthiest neighborhoods do, because that's important to air quality. Neighborhoods with a majority of people of color have 33% less tree canopy than the majority white communities. And in Minnesota, tree canopy also helps with energy costs. Frogtown is a neighborhood in St. Paul. I'm going to bring it on home, as many of the others have done it. It's a historically redlined community, and like many communities, it experienced higher rates of pollution, in part because of a freeway that was forced into this community that brought pollution along with it. So this community experiences higher rates of health issues that are negative. One example would be asthma. So Frogtown, the neighborhood I'm going to talk about, has a neighborhood campaign, and it's working to change the tree canopy issue. And I'm proud to have supported their work in the Frogtown Park and Farm group that has planted over 500 trees in this neighborhood. So equal access to an urban canopy, equal access to green space, equal access to community gardens makes EJ communities more resilient to rising temperatures and improves overall community health. There's so many opportunities to get this right. I gave one example: increasing an urban canopy. Facilitating new green jobs is also another thing we can do. Working towards a green infrastructure is another opportunity. So I believe we can use the model of E&G for all to act to build on equitable access and to support new legislative efforts as well. An example I have is the Mississippi River Restoration and Resilience Initiative Act. I incorporated and put in set-asides dedicated to support and ensure environmental justice communities have equal access to changing their future. The bipartisan infrastructure law that we just passed is also making important investments to remove lead lines and clean up PFAS in EJ communities. Progress is a result of listening and working with advocates such as many of the people who have testified to this committee and the people who are testifying today, and listening to community members who are directly impacted by the harm that has been caused in the past. So I want to thank our witnesses today, and I have two questions, but I'm going to ask you to submit them in writing to the committee. Ms. Cortez, could you please tell us more about some of the EJ communities and how they're typically challenged in getting access federal funding to improve their own environmental conditions and building green infrastructure, and how the EJ for Act will help us in that effort, if you would do that? And then Dr. Sheets, I'm going to turn to a different topic and ask you to respond, and we'll get to these questions in writing to both of you. Your testimony notes that there's been a cumulative impacts of pollutants. It's been a difficult problem to solve, and especially when it's associated with race and income. So I'd like you to maybe help us understand a little more by answering the question in full later on to the committee with the research that you've done to highlight this issue. And what can we do at a federal level to help combat these disproportionate exposures to all these multiple different types of pollution found in low-income communities and communities of color? Because the disparity issue is also an issue of accumulative pollutants and exposure over generations. Thank you all for your testimony, and I look forward to the committee receiving the response to my written questions that will be submitted through the committee. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Gentlelady yields back, and let me recognize Mr. Rosendale. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And Mayor Brower, just to get you on the batter's deck, I'm going to be going to you as soon as I complete this short statement. There's been a lot of talk today about environmental justice, but I don't think my colleagues on the other side of the aisle realize the extent of the economic injustice these policies will have. Many of the provisions of this bill will create new and burdensome regulations, causing more litigation longer permitting times, and less economic development. In Montana, traditional energy and coal is crucial to many of our small communities. Take the Crow Tribe, for example. For 46 years, they've leased their coal reserve to Westmoreland Mining, which operates the Absaloka mine in southeastern Montana. In the last 2 decades, this partnership has generated more than $325 million in taxes and royalties, which play a vital role for the Crow Tribe. Funding the tribal government, providing essential services, and supporting tribal members with per capita royalty payments. The Absaloka mine also generates opportunity. It employs dozens of tribal members, providing good paying jobs to workers and economic stability for their families. In fact, in 2021, 59% of Absaloka mine employees were Crow Tribe members. This partnership between the Crow Tribe and Westmoreland Mining empowers tribal members to provide brighter futures for themselves and for their families. Mr. Brower, partnerships like these are not just unique to Montana. Can you describe the economic benefits that the Northern Petroleum Reserve Alaska provided and what subsequently happened in the North Slope due to federal intervention?
And thank you for the question. And I think it's very important to reflect on the positive outcomes at times, but in terms of the loss of services that generates from the reduction of production and taxation to the North Slope borough, we as a borough start thinking of going through budget cuts as we're doing right now. We're just getting into our budget cycle, and it impacts the whole North Slope borough. It's just not one community. It's all 8 communities across the North Slope that are impacted from determinations of this type. Now we have to think of what's happening for the next 2 to 3 years in terms of our operations, and revenues continue to decline. When thoughts of higher costs for expenses of resources, we pay $5.75 a gallon, $5.95 a gallon for gas. And then a 100-pound bottle of propane is nearly $500, and that only lasts a month. And these kind of jobs that were being provided by oil industry and gas industry operations now are diminishing because of the actions that this administration has taken. I hope that helped me identify the questions you were proposing.
Sure. And I want to go a little bit further. We've seen time and time again, this administration has ignored the voices of those who they claim to represent, whether it's the communities in North Slope or the hundreds of thousands of Montanans who would have greatly benefited from the Keystone XL pipeline. So I want to reiterate a quote that we heard earlier in a hearing of last year, and that is, "No decisions about us without us." So in regards to the Willow project, did anyone consult you or your community members before making these decisions? And do you feel like justice has been served?
I would say no. That, it was after the fact determinations were met that we were provided information. This is the path that this administration is taking. So the immediate answer is no. There's no real consultation.
In your opinion, was there adequate safeguards in place to develop these resources safely and in a manner to have a positive impact on your community?
I think it took several years of communications through the NEPA process, interactions with several of our villages, hosting meetings in villages, reviewing the documents of the environmental impact statements and such to the Willow project. It took several years. It just didn't happen overnight. So yes, there was interaction between the industry, the federal government representatives, and the North Slope Borough in making these determinations.
Thank you very much for joining us, Mayor Brower. And Mr. Chair, I see that my time has expired. I would yield back.
Thank you. Gentleman yields, and let me recognize Mr. Huffman, Mr. Chairman, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So several of our GOP colleagues are incredulous that Democrats see racial impacts in the way our environmental policy has worked for most of our history. And they want us to stop talking so much about race and disparate impacts and environmental justice and just keep doing the same old things the same old way. I could not disagree more, Mr. Chairman. How can we not see the racism, even if some of it is not overt or intentional? The disproportionate impacts are so obvious. How can we not talk honestly about that and work to do more to end it? That's what you and Mr. McEachin are doing with this bill. And Mr. Chairman, I'm proud to support you. The story of economic development for most of our country's history is that people with money and power, who were always white, did what they wanted. And the impacts were borne by people without money and power, who were generally Black, brown, and indigenous. And a great example is in my district. We are rich in indigenous culture in the 2nd District in California. And tribes and other partners have been working for decades to remove 4 obsolete hydro dams on the lower Klamath River. When these dams were built, nobody bothered to talk to downstream tribes or fishing communities. The bedrock environmental laws that our Republican friends continually mock and deride as creating litigation, well, they would have given tribes and downstream communities a voice, but they didn't exist when these dams were built. And so for decades, the Yurok, Karuk, and Hupa tribes, along with downstream fishing communities, suffered terrible impacts, lost salmon habitat, badly degraded water quality that causes parasites and disease to ravage the salmon population, closing entire fisheries, devastating their economies and way of life. Now, the environmental laws that we began passing in the 1970s finally gave people like this a voice. But as we've heard from the ranking member and so many other colleagues across the aisle, when minority communities use environmental laws to challenge projects that would harm them with pollution and other impacts, they are derided as litigious. I have to admire the clarity of what seems to be the Republican EJ policy. Whenever tribal or minority voices conflict with something the fossil fuel or mining industries want to do, like the many tribes who oppose Keystone XL, Dakota Access Pipeline, other destructive fossil fuel projects, the policy is to just ignore them, steamroll them, ridicule them as litigious. But when they can find a tribal or minority voice that supports a drilling or a mining project, they temporarily become interested in environmental justice. Now, Mr. Chairman, the Gwich'in people and other indigenous people on the North Slope would tell you a very different story about oil and gas development in Arctic Alaska than what we've heard today from the Republican side. There is no question the voices of fossil fuel advocates were heard by the Trump administration when they fast-tracked drilling projects, but other voices were not heard, and that's the problem. I agree with my colleague Don Young. We shouldn't pick and choose, but that means EJ voices should be heard and considered even when they conflict with powerful polluting industries, even when they don't get piles of money from the fossil fuel industry, even when they struggle to find the resources to engage in something like a NEPA process. And that's why your bill, Mr. Chairman, is so important. And so is the Biden's Justice 40 initiative, the Biden administration's. With a whole bunch of federal infrastructure funding, we have an opportunity right now to get this right in the context of building the infrastructure of the 21st century. So, Dr. Sheets, I just want to ask you, how can the Justice 40 initiative ensure a fair distribution of federal resources to communities that have been historically left behind?
Well, I think we're going to have to ensure, and you've been talking about it, we've all been talking about it, ensure the local communities have a say in where the benefits from Justice 40, the activities we're talking about, where the benefits and the funding go. I think in each case, we're going to have to set up some system where the local residents, local community groups, local EJ groups, local citizens have a say in that and actually provide guidance.
Anything more the federal government can do to ensure that tribes and other EJ communities have the resources and support they need to take advantage of these opportunities?
Well, just what you said, yeah, I know you want more details, but even that and what you said is kind of a novel idea that the federal government should take steps to ensure that the groups on the ground, including indigenous groups and tribes, have the capacity to be part of the implementation and the decision making in these instances. So we have to find ways to do that through grants and other mechanisms to do that.
It's an important part of the chairman's bill. And with that, I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, sir. Gentleman yields. Let me recognize Mr. Obernolt. Sir, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our witnesses for what's been a fascinating hearing. Mayor Brower, I found your testimony very poignant. The bill that we're considering today would make projects like the energy exploration that's permitted in your community substantially more difficult and more costly, and would lead to fewer of them. You had testified that about 95% of the borough's revenue comes from the royalties on these kinds of projects. Can you talk to us just a little bit about the impacts on your community if you didn't have that revenue?
Hello?
Go ahead, Mayor. We can hear you.
Thank you. Yet in regard to the 95% tax revenue that supports the board comes from the taxation of oil and gas property in our region. The revenues support health clinics, schools, tribal college, water and sewer infrastructure, fire department, search and rescue. These are essential services that we identify with that are needed within our communities, within the North Slope region. It's something that we have to hold high standards for to provide services and the need, and we welcome the taxation to the oil industry for the services it provides across the North Slope. Without the fuel, we'd be in a world of hurt today.
Right.
You know, we're very fortunate we have 2 communities that are on natural gas. The rest are utilizing the diesel fuel that serves the smaller communities.
Right.
So that's something that we continue to communicate on. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Mayor Brower. Ms. Cortez, I had a question for you. So in your testimony, you called the effects of the pollution in your community environmental racism. And we just heard Mayor Brower talk about the disastrous impacts that denying that community the ability to profit from the resources adjacent to their community would have on things like their drinking water and their health care. And of course, I mean, the mayor represents one of the most marginalized communities in the country. How would denying them the ability to do that not also be environmental racism?
Yeah, thank you for that question, because I think I don't know too much about Alaska, but in hearing a lot of how investing in fossil fuels, right, is a leading driver of our economy, is a similar issue of what we have here in Los Angeles. We are an urban economy. We are driven by these fossil fuel like investments, right? And for us, it is very marked, and we stand very firmly that this is not sustainable. It doesn't matter if you can extract these fossil fuels. It doesn't matter if we can get jobs off of them, if we're going to die, if my lungs are being actively impacted daily. And so it doesn't matter. Like at the end of the day, yes, does money matter? Yes, we live in a capitalist society. I understand that. We are not foolish to think that this is an overnight response. What's important to know is that we need investments now to transition to alternative jobs, to alternative energy sources that can then, so that Alaska, Los Angeles, and across the nation, we don't have to rely on these things. And that starts through federal policy. That starts through federal investment.
Right. I think that's highlighting something that we're all in furious agreement in here. And we've kind of had a fascinating discussion this morning, about this term environmental racism. I think Congressman Graves pointed out the fact that to have racism, you have to have intentionality because it's discrimination against a marginalized community. And then Congressman McEachin was talking about, well, it really doesn't matter if it's intentional. What matters is the effects on these communities. And I strongly agree with both of those gentlemen. And I wish that we could have a more frank discussion about that term racism when we use it, because I think it distracts from our shared goal of solving these problems for these communities. That's the important thing. And when we use words like racism, I think it distracts away from that goal. But I want to thank all of our witnesses for what's been a fascinating discussion, and I hope this kind of moves the conversation further. I yield back, Mr. Chair.
Gentleman yields. Thank you. Mr. Lowenthal is recognized for 5 minutes. Chairman?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I'm glad also that we've come together to discuss this critically important issue. I remembered as I was beginning to prepare for this, when I first ran for office 30 years ago for city council in the city of Long Beach. And I walked my district, and as I got closer, my district encompassed the southern part of the 710 freeway and the port of Long Beach, and the adjacent also didn't include, but it was obviously the adjacent port of LA was right backed up right to my district. And as I walked and I got closer and closer to the port area and to the 710, more and more people said, as I was coming to tell them why I was running for office, more and more people said, Alan, that's really interesting why you're doing that. But can you tell me what's this black soot in the window? And as I got closer to the port, they would talk more about that black soot, and they'd ask me, does it really have an effect? My kids have asthma. What is all of this all about? So I become more and more aware as I studied what that black soot was, that certain communities in Long Beach that were near this tremendous industrial complex of our ports and freeways suffered much greater from black soot than the more suburban communities. And I know there's no quick fix to fixing this, but it's been 30 years and these communities are still suffering, even though we've made some giant steps and taken some steps. And I want to thank the chair and also Mr. McEachin for their leadership on the Environmental Justice for All Act. And I appreciate the dedication of everyone on this committee to talking about solutions, because I think whatever terminology you want to use, I think both sides of the aisle have agreed that there are some communities that are paying a much greater price for the economic development in this country than other communities. And those communities tend to be low-income communities, frequently first-generation communities, immigrant communities, and also people who have not been allowed or have not historically engaged in the economic development of this country. So my first question is to Ms. Cortez. I'm so, and over the years, been very impressed and grateful for the leadership of East Yard communities for environmental justice. But I'd like you, who've been out there in the field, on the streets, to tell me more about the environmental injustice that my community suffers on the west side of Long Beach. Can you talk more about the very specifics that people who grow up near the ports, near the 710 freeway, like yourself, what's that experience like?
Yeah, I appreciate that question because it allows folks to visualize, right, what we may or may not see. I think it's really important to note that specifically also Long Beach is huge, but specifically the west side of Long Beach is actually divided. It's on the other side of the 710 freeway, and that is a marker, right? Folks here, the other side of the train tracks. These are things that are systemic, but that have huge impacts in terms of place, relations to pollution and race, right? And I understand folks not wanting to bring race into this conversation, but folks who live in the west side of Long Beach is not the same demographic that lives in East Long Beach. It's not the same demographic that lives in other areas. And so with West Long Beach, it is primarily immigrant. It is primarily Black, Indigenous, people of color. These folks, there are a range of folks. There are also white folks there, right? But a majority of folks are Black, Indigenous, people of color. In West Side specifically, we have a small terminus freeway that is specifically created for trucks. There is the 710 freeway, which I mentioned sees 40 to 60,000 truck trips daily, because it is very close to the port complex, which is a port complex that sees 40% of all goods that come into this country come through those ports, right? Up the 710 freeway to get to the rail yards. There's also right now a proposed new rail yard development, a new intermodal facility being proposed right next to West Long Beach. And so it's really important to look at, these are the cumulative impacts that we're talking about, that that are not being addressed in any policy right now, but that could be addressed with this new policy.
Well, thank you. My time is up. And just before I leave, I also want to talk about, I remember having a community meeting in one of the homes on the west side, and the health director of Long Beach said, you know, if you were born on the west side of Long Beach, your life expectancy is 10 to 15 years less than the life expectancy of someone who's born out on the east side. So I yield back.
And let me recognize Mr. Bentz. Representative, you're recognized for 5 minutes, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thanks everyone for most interesting conversation. I have some questions for Professor Khan, and I want to start by asking if the Constitution as currently written contains a right for those important things such as clean air, clean water, so forth, that are found in this bill. Does our Constitution contain a specific right to enjoy those benefits?
Our federal constitution does not. There are actually increasing numbers of state constitutions who've established a right to a healthy environment or right to clean air and water, including New York being the most recent.
Thank you. And as I understood it, it was about 3 states. So yeah, I think, but I'm sorry, I just looked at it this morning. There could be more. The second question, does, in your opinion, this bill create those rights, specifically in the findings and then in the second portion of the bill? So does this bill create those rights?
This bill creates very clear environmental justice protections and that demand action on the part of the federal government through amendments to NEPA, through amendments to the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act, as well as by restoring the private cause of action under Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964.
I'm just looking at page 4, subsection 9. All people have it reads, all people have the right to breathe clean air, drink clean water, live free of dangerous levels of toxic pollution, and share the benefits of a prosperous and vibrant pollution-free economy. Appears to me, and then later on, there are instructions to agencies even more direct than that. So it would appear to me that there's something being created. If it's not a right, it certainly is a basis for a lawsuit. Wouldn't you agree?
I would have to really think through the strategy on that, but I do see the bill as really strengthening the rights of the communities who have historically been disproportionately impacted by environmental and climate burdens, and creating opportunities for environmental benefits and climate solutions.
Right. Well, I think you're being, I don't think I would have gotten away with that answer when I was going to law school, but of course I was going to Lewis and Clark in Portland, not to Vermont. And by the way, you guys have a great environmental program there. So I think we're constantly trading places with you as to who's ranked #1 in the nation. Now,
I can answer that question. Yes,
we are. In any event, I read it as giving rights to folks, and thus lawyers will be ecstatic should this bill pass. And particularly with the last right that is suggested here, which is to share in the benefits of a prosperous and vibrant pollution-free economy. Well, that sounds pretty broad. What happens if I go in and say, hey, I don't have as much value, I don't have the economic benefit? Does this bill give us, the lawyers, the right to argue that if someone doesn't have as much money as somebody else, we can use this bill to suggest that we should be equal on that basis, too? we should all have the same amount of economic benefit? Is that what this bill does?
Well, I think this bill is intended to provide benefits to communities who have been historically disinvested, and that there is actually an economic benefit for our country at large when we do that, when we support the and improve health outcomes in communities where those outcomes have been disproportionately burdened. Then there's actually an economic benefit to everyone.
It seems to me that what this does is throw to the courts the definition of extent and scope of whatever it is this bill says it's doing, which I think is wrong. The bill should be far more clear in that which it's trying to achieve. On environmental injustice, although this bill appears to be directed toward communities of color and other minorities, I would suggest it's broader than that. And those in Oregon along the West Coast suffering from smoke inhalation from the fires that in large part are created by the failure to allow us to go in and try to reduce fuel loads. It looks to me like this bill gives all kinds of folks the right to bring action against whoever it is that's preventing us from getting in and protecting ourselves from that type of future. Mr. Chair, this is an extraordinarily interesting bill. I think one that deserves a lot more work before we turn the trial lawyers of America loose, utilizing it to do God knows what. With that, Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Gentleman yields. Thank you. And let me recognize Chair of the subcommittee, Ms. Legend Fernandez. Representative, you're recognized.
Thank you so much, Chair Grijalva. And I want to begin my comments of focusing on the fact that this bill is called the Environmental Justice, right? That we are focused on making sure that everybody has justice in the same sense of access to that clean air, access to economic opportunities that don't come at the expense of somebody else's health. And I wanted to ask a bit of questioning on the concept of the disparate impact and what Sandoval did to our ability to have communities say, this is negatively impacting my health. And it's the impact that we're focusing on. So we're moving away from saying, we don't need to, and I don't think there is anything in this bill that is talking about that we have to prove racism. We simply are asking that everybody have the same ability to live in a community where they are not subject to an environment that is toxic to their health, especially when they don't have the resources to move somewhere else. And so, Ms. Khan, can you explain why reinserting the ability of bringing a cause of action that focuses on disparate impact gives an important tool to the communities that are living under a burden of, like in New Mexico, high methane emissions? You know, we exploded an atomic bomb here, and the people who are exposed to that haven't been able to get compensation. We have high levels of methane. We have one of the biggest methane clouds in the sky over our part of our state. Why is the use of disparate impact important?
Thank you so much for that question. And I've been pondering this throughout the whole hearing because there's been some dialogue around whether intent is necessary to prove discrimination. And intentional discrimination is in fact is real, and we see intentional discrimination cases all the time. But disparate impact is also prohibited under Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And that was part of the intent of the legislation. It was part of the intent, and there is documented legislative history and statements by President John F. Kennedy about the need to prevent actions, programs, and activities with the impact, discriminatory impact on communities, that we need to ensure that this bill covers those as well. And those are, there are countless examples of how that plays out. It's failing to account for how emissions from a facility would disproportionately expose communities of color to high levels of air pollution. Failing to account for how rerouting a roadway would have a disparate impact on the air quality or the safety or the quality of life for residents in a community of color, or refusing to offer simultaneous interpretation as disruptive, or providing a Spanish language translation of a permitting decision a week later than the English language version, but keeping the comment period the
Ms.
same.
Khan, thank you so very much. I wanted to get to a couple of other questions. So I'm going to move on to the issue of the cumulative impact. Two things. One, the cumulative impact and the importance of not looking. I keep thinking about it's like, you know, we're going to look at this project through a keyhole. And as long as we see that there is a bit of blue sky from that keyhole, we're fine. Whereas if we open up our vista and we can see the communities adjacent to that project and how there are lots of other impacts, that is so key. And Ms. Cortez, I really appreciated the fact that you pointed out the importance of that there is not, you don't have to eliminate jobs and economic growth while you are looking to solve these issues. And I appreciate that in this bill, that it is putting more funds and resources into those communities that have fueled or that have energized through fossil fuel and other things our economy, right? I have several bills that seek to do that, that seek to invest in that. So if you could describe to me a bit why you think it's important that your community, as organized as you become, has the tools that you need, that this bill gives you, so that you can protect your ability to thrive and to live in this environment that is cleaner than what you do now.
Yeah, thank you. And I'll make it really quick that the reality is that we already have so much education and tools that we've already implemented locally, that we've already implemented regionally. And either we have succeeded and have proven it, either we have failed and learned and gone back and done it, or we have realized that agencies, municipalities, state legislation is not going to move until the federal government can set an example by passing policies like EJ for All to, one, invest by giving us the tools to be able to do this work, or pass policy that shows them that we are just as important and that they should also pass these more local, more smaller policies with us.
Thank you. My time has expired. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentlelady yields back, and let me now recognize Representative Tlaib. Representative, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Chairman. I can't thank you enough for your leadership on this, and of course, our colleague, Congressman McCheechin, on just really leading us and trying to make sure that we have a good quality of life for many of our residents that have to take the brunt of environmental pollution. You know, there's been so much discussion, and first of all, to Director Cortez, the center you co-direct and the work that you're doing in your community reminds me of growing up in Southwest Detroit. What must be distressing to all of you, as you all are listening to this, is language saying, quote, "you people." And so I want to apologize for that kind of rhetoric of you are our people, including our Indigenous brothers and sisters across our nation. You are our people. You are not you people. And so I just want to really set that tone, because it is so critically important that as folks are talking about this, and, Director Khan, I want to ask you this because, I want to ask you, does jobs fix cancer?
Does jobs, this is a false choice.
Does having a job, does that fix cancer?
Having a job does not fix cancer, and also it's not it's a false choice.
Does it fix the asthma? Does it fix the asthma rate? How about you, Director Cortez? Does jobs fix asthma?
No, it does not.
And let me also ask, Dr. Sheets, one of the things that I keep stressing, everybody keeps talking about, the high cost of natural gas, the high cost of do you know that it's been increased? Did you know this, that it increased by like 30% or so, the cost of asthma inhalers? Just yesterday, one of the mothers in my community was testifying about an asphalt plant coming into her neighborhood and how she had to put $300 aside to pay for asthma inhalers for her children, for her boys. I mean, Dr. Sheets, do you ever monitor the cost of public health in essence of where people are living in, with environmental pollution? Has anybody ever looked at it? Dr. Cortez, Dr. Sheets, or Director Khan, have any of you looked at the cost of public health in living in its high polluted neighborhoods?
Yeah, I'll just share very quickly that I remember there being an EPA statistic a long time ago that said if we fix this thing, this like industrial thing, we would actually be saving this much money and health impacts. That statistic was from about 20 years ago, and I have not seen another statistic since on how to quantify and really focusing on public health as a real investment, as something that is monetary and just as valuable or more valuable, right, than these other economic impacts that folks talk about.
How about you, Director Khan?
Well, I just keep thinking about the situation under COVID-19, under the pandemic, and the costs right now. Think about the costs of preventing particulate matter pollution 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 30 years ago, and the economic and health benefits that communities that have been overburdened for that long would feel in this moment, who are otherwise disproportionately affected by infection rates, severity, and death from COVID-19.
Well, you know, Dr. Sheets, I do want to put this in a congressional record for the chairman and for my colleagues. You know, more of my Black neighbors died from COVID because of pre-existing conditions, even though they make up less than 14% of the total population in the state of Michigan. And I really believe if you look at the statistics around Flint, around Detroit, around other communities that are predominantly, you know, people of color, my Black neighbors, they died at a higher rate of COVID. Dr. Sheets, do you believe that's because most of them are bearing the brunt, of, you know, environmental pollution, corporate pollution?
I think, of course, we don't know their personal circumstance, but I believe that's a part of it. I think one thing that always strikes me about COVID-19 pandemic is that, and we've talked a lot about race today, so
Yeah.
I'll just go ahead and say it. Even
No, don't. This is your Congress, not just some people's. You can say it.
You know, I think I think COVID-19 in some ways showed how insidious race is, because I would not have predicted that one reason that people of color die higher from COVID-19 is because a higher percentage of us, doesn't include me, but a higher percentage of us have to actually go out and be in the world and work and can't stay home and work remotely.
Yeah.
And I think it shows that racial impacts are very hard to predict, and that we have to take every opportunity we can to address.
And I know I have a little bit of time, but before, Chairman, if I may, can I please submit for the record? I think it's very, very important because cumulative impact analysis and the environmental justice for all is so important to my community. But for the record, please, can I submit an article by the Detroit Free Press that said 175 million tax break for Marathon Refinery buys Detroiters only 15 jobs. And I will explain this later in future job, but we gave $175 million in the time we were struggling in Detroit in exchange for jobs, and they only gave us 15. And do you know that is the zip code is the most polluted zip code in the state of Michigan? So if I may, can I submit that for the record?
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you, and I yield.
Thank you very much. Let me now recognize the gentlelady from New Mexico, Ms. Stansberry. You're recognized, Representative, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Chairman Grijalva, for introducing this bill and for convening this hearing. And I too want to extend my thanks to all of the witnesses for joining us today from all over the country and sharing your experiences, your feedback, your expertise, and helping to shape this legislation and to be educators to the public and to our communities about what we're trying to accomplish with this bill. I too am a proud co-sponsor of the Environmental Justice for All bill, and I'm deeply proud of the process that the chairman and Chairman McEachin and others engaged in to create this bill, that it was a community-led process that included engagement with organizations and communities across the United States and incorporated the feedback of hundreds of people across the US. So let me be clear. Our communities must be at the table in making decisions that affect their quality of life, their health, and their futures. And that is what this bill is fundamentally about. It's about putting the power, the tools, and the resources back into our communities that have experienced the disproportionate impacts and legacies of pollution and the disproportionate impacts of economic development that have harmed our communities, so that they have the power to control their own destinies going forward. So I am so grateful for this bill and all of the incredible work that has gone into it. Obviously, the goals of this bill are to strengthen the NEPA process, to provide data and tools to prevent harmful environmental impacts, to account for those impacts holistically across our environmental laws when we're doing permitting and allowing activities on the landscape. It's to ensure that our federal agencies are coordinating with each other, and that there are people at those agencies that are not just looking out for the economic impacts and benefits for our communities, but are looking out for our communities themselves and making sure that their voices are heard in the process as we're undertaking to permit and allow activities and invest federal resources, and to put those tools and resources into our communities themselves so that they have the power to shape their own destiny. And nowhere is this more important than in New Mexico, where our state and our communities have faced this historical legacy and disproportionate impacts. I've heard a lot of discussion today questioning the history and the reality of what we know to be the truth inside of our communities. So let me just say, this is not hypothetical in New Mexico. Our history and our landscape is peppered with the examples of how this historical legacy has impacted our communities. In Western New Mexico, we have communities that are still living with the impacts of uranium mining. We have Pueblo and Dene and Chicano communities that are still dealing with mines that have been left unremediated and contaminated groundwater that is undrinkable. In the north, we have Pueblo and Hispano communities that have lived in valleys for countless generations that now have groundwater contamination caused by our government's nuclear experiments. In the east, we have dairies and ranchers and farmers whose entire operations have been destroyed by PFAS contamination because of federal activities. And in the south, as Representative Ledger Fernandez talked about, we have downwind communities in the Tularosa Basin who were exposed to radiation in 1945 and that for generations have experienced cancer and health impacts that are still killing people today in those communities. So this is not a hypothetical. This is something that has affected our communities for generations, and we need tools. We have to modernize our federal government. We need to ensure that there are people and processes and opportunities and resources for our communities to have their voices heard as decisions are being made, and that they can help to reimagine the futures that they want to see for themselves in their communities. So I want to thank everybody who was involved in shaping this legislation, and thank you, especially Mr. Chairman, for your vision and your ability to bring people together to help shape and create an opportunity for this bill. And I want to just turn very quickly to Dr. Sheets, to Ms. Cortez, and others here to say, can you please just reiterate, we've been talking about this all morning, but why is it so important that our communities have a seat at the table? Starting with you, Dr. Sheets.
I think it gives our communities a fighting chance to address the pollution, elevated levels of pollution often found in environmental justice communities. Gives them some hope and a fighting chance to do so.
Thank you. And Ms. Cortez?
Yeah, I think for us, we have nothing to lose. Literally, like, this is our lives and we will continue fighting for it. And this policy and any policy that is truly focused on EJ, we will continue fighting for it, and we will continue fighting for a seat at this table.
Thank you very much. And thank you all so much for being here this morning and for lending your voices and your expertise to this very important bill. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
And the lady yields. Let me recognize Representative Porter. Madam Chair, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Dr. Sheets, this is a map of abandoned and active oil wells in Southern California. And as you can see, there are a lot of them. And this is true in many parts of our country. Under current federal law, if an oil company wants to open another oil well on federal land in a place where there already are lots and lots of oil wells, would they have to consider other facilities in the area during the permitting process and limit new pollution based on the cumulative effects?
The way, and I hope I don't get this wrong, but let me say this, the way I understand it now is that within a certain category of pollution, they have to consider other sources, but across pollutants, they would not.
Okay. So they don't necessarily have to mitigate or account for air pollution. For example, if their facility would create water pollution, even they're adding another polluting facility. My understanding is that there are no limits on pollution under current law based on cumulative impacts. Ms. Cortez, do you or anyone else have a thought on that?
I do not. I will defer to my colleagues.
The total amount of pollution does not have to be taken into account in the neighborhood.
Okay.
From our source.
Because of that, in your experience, do oil and gas companies deliberately pick low-income and frontline communities for their facilities?
Yes, this is Laura.
Yeah. Why, Ms. Cortez?
Yeah, because the processes are so complex, it doesn't, these companies are able to come into our communities with things like an EIR, a negative declaration, in which community members who are already struggling to make ends meet, are working two jobs, can't find childcare, are having health impacts, are having to go to the emergency room, are not able to fully participate in challenging these projects. A lot of times, like I said, there's even a negative declaration, so it doesn't even undergo a process which allows for the continued systemic placing of these facilities near our homes.
And my understanding is that the Environmental Justice for All Act, one of the ways it would address that is to permit, it would amend the Civil Rights Act of 1964 to prohibit discrimination based on disparate impact. And it would effectively allow these low-income communities, when they are harmed and it's disproportionate to them, to be able to raise discrimination claims on that basis. Are companies right now currently cleaning up their pollution in these communities, Ms. Cortez?
Yes, they are not. So many of them are allowed to leave. A lot of them just abandon ship, and these are what we now call brownfields in our communities. And because Los Angeles is such an urban area, what we see is that the only sites that are open, that there's nothing developed on, is because they are brownfields that continue to pollute our communities through gas emissions.
Yep, and we have abandoned oil and gas wells, and that's part of what this map shows. Is there's purple dots and blue dots, and a lot of these are abandoned, and they're sitting there, leaving taxpayers with the bill. I want to enter into the record a story from Market Watch last week that said oil is the hottest sector, and Wall Street analysts see upside of up to 48% for favored stocks. And those companies include some of the biggest oil and gas producers on public land, like Chevron and Phillips. Instead of covering the costs of their pollution, they are giving out dividends to their investors. We are all getting cheated as a result because we all have an interest in our public lands, but frontline communities are literally paying with their health, as you point out. Ms. Khan, I want to turn to climate change quickly. How do national policies help local communities increase their resilience to climate change?
I think that the EJ for All Act provides a whole set of resources that could help local communities really invest in climate resilience and climate adaptation, and do so in a way that puts communities at the lead. So there are a host of funds. I think of it in particularly the open space funds that are dedicated in the EJ for All Act. There's one of the legacies of disinvestment has been the lack of green garden and open spaces and tree cover, which has an impact on air quality, has an impact on health, also has an impact on stormwater management. And communities have responded by creating green garden and open spaces in the face of disinvestment, but those spaces are largely land insecure. So the open space funds in the EJ for All Act actually could provide for land acquisition, also technical assistance, and provide ways to either create new or preserve existing spaces that would increase climate resilience.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I yield back.
Very much. Gentlelady yields. Recognized gentleman from Florida, Mr. Soto. You're recognized, Representative.
Thank you, Chairman. Colleagues, America is finally emerging from crisis. We passed the American Rescue Plan, shots in arms, money in pockets, and we avoided another Great Recession. 77% of Americans are now vaccinated and cases are dropping. Unemployment is a low 4%. We've avoided a key foreclosure crisis in Florida and across the nation. Pensions and 401ks were saved, and now we're turning to combat inflation, supply chain, price gouging, managing the pandemic, and possibly even a gas tax holiday are all in the works. Thanks to my colleagues on the Democratic side, sadly, all Republicans voted no. Then we passed the infrastructure plan, roads and bridges, airports and ports, water and electric reforms, $21 billion for environmental remediation brownfields, which I'll get to in a moment, rural broadband, and infrastructure equity, like what we're talking about here today, breaking down those barriers, reconnecting communities. Thanks to Representative Don Young for voting yes. Sadly, the rest of you voted no. A couple of you even tried to take credit back home, but were quickly rebuffed by your local press. And now we're going to work on the American Competes Act, domestic manufacturing, microchips, biotech, aerospace, telecom, medical supplies. We're making microchips back in the district now, and this is going to be huge for us. Again, all of you voted no. I'm hoping that you'll change your mind as we get to a final vote after the Senate. We need to come together. In our area in Florida, we've seen coal plants closing, and coal ash storage is an issue in Orange County and in Osceola County. We've boosted solar, wind, natural gas. We may even extend or expand our nuclear capacity, but highly toxic coal ash is an issue. Some was even trucked in recently to Osceola County, but we put a stop to that. Dr. Sheets, have you seen similar issues in communities where toxic pollution has compounded from multiple sources, and what are the health implications for all those living in those communities?
Yeah, well, we certainly see that in New Jersey. Actually, in Newark, New Jersey DEP, Department of Environmental Protection, has actually acknowledged it's a place that suffers from cumulative impacts, and I think we see the results in the number of kids that miss school, asthma attacks associated with air pollution, and in the health disparities that exist in our nation. Again, part of the reason we believe is because of the disparate amount of pollution in our communities.
And Dr. Sheets, how would the Environmental Justice for All Act help address these issues of cumulative pollution impacts?
Well, finally, a gap in our laws and regulations will begin to be filled because it would mandate that the cumulative impact analysis take into account all the pollution in a neighborhood and not just look at pollution, individual pollutants, and ask if those individual standards are violated. We would take a more holistic approach and say, hey, the super pollution in the neighborhood has to be taken into account.
Ms. Cortez, we passed $21 billion for environmental remediation in the Build Back Better infrastructure package. What do you think would be one or two areas of focus that we should work on to remediate past environmental justice issues?
Yeah, I think remediation of brownfields, as I was mentioning earlier, is super important because these areas are toxic. A lot of these areas are dirt, they're uncovered. Some of us, if we don't know how to find the tools, we don't even know what toxics we're being exposed to, but a lot of them are adjacent to homes. We've seen that happen here where brownfields are active polluting sites have caused numerous metal type of cancers where folks are actively dying even after the facility is shut down.
Ms. Khan, what would be your recommendation for us to focus on for the $21 billion in environmental remediation we passed?
I would actually have to say, let's start by consulting with communities about where the needs are greatest, and where and the spaces that have been left unremediated for the longest. I will say that you know, there have been recent studies, actually, I think 2 years ago by the EPA, looking at the intersection of climate risk and brownfields and Superfund risk. And so I would also say, let's look at the spaces that are at risk of flooding and have the potential to spread toxins throughout a neighborhood, exacerbating health impacts.
Thanks, and I yield back.
Thank you. Gentleman yields. Let me now turn to gentleman from Chicago, Mr. Garcia. Sir, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Grijalva, and of course, all of our outstanding witnesses. And of course, thank you to Congressman Cheatham for the Environmental Justice Bill. Look, everyone deserves a safe and healthy place in which to work, live, play, and learn. And we all have the right to pure air, clean water, and an environment that enriches our lives. But the reality is that for too many people of color and low-income communities, including the ones I represent, they lack access to these basic fundamental rights. In 2022, Chicago still has an uneven and inequitable exposure to pollution and toxins across its neighborhoods. A question for Dr. Sheets. I know you've done crucial work in New Jersey to push back against the disproportionate siting of toxic and hazardous facilities in communities of color and low-income communities. In my district, we're dealing with similar issues. Recently, 2 companies have been with abysmal track records when it comes to the environment and with the issues of safety of the communities that they enter have indicated intentions to establish plants in locations in Chicago on the south and west sides. We've called on city officials to reject those applications in order to protect the health of our neighbors who are already overburdened by pollution. My question is, how would the robust cumulative impact assessments proposed in the Environmental Justice for All Act help prevent this type of injustice?
I think that the cumulative impacts provision in EJ for All Act would very nicely address this issue because, again, it says that if due to cumulative impacts, there is not a reasonable certainty of no harm. And in doing the cumulative impact analysis, you'd have to take into account the existing pollution and the pollution that would be added by the facilities that want to come into that community. And if that standard is violated, if it will cause harm to the community, then the permit won't be issued. So I think it could play a major role in protecting those communities.
So incorporating what we've learned and new technology is essential to making places safe and healthy for everyone. Dr. Sheets, you helped pass the groundbreaking legislation in the state of New Jersey that requires an assessment of cumulative impacts and set a limit on cumulative impact pollution in overburdened areas. You also helped craft a municipal ordinance for the city of Newark on environmental justice and cumulative impacts. You've seen these cumulative impact policies be implemented at the local and state level. Can you speak to why the federal government should also be required to consider cumulative impacts?
Yeah, well, and I should say we're waiting for the state regulations to be issued any day now. We have high anticipation, and that they will help our communities. And it's not enough to do this though on a state-by-state basis, because currently New Jersey is the only state that has passed a law that says you should deny permits under certain circumstances based on cumulative impacts. Some other states are interested, but that doesn't replace national legislation. How about all the vast majority of the states that are not contemplating passing such cumulative impact legislation? All the communities, all those other communities in those states should be protected, and the EJ for All Act would help to protect them.
And last week, this committee held a hearing to examine the lack of justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion within environmental non-government organizations and grant-making foundations, and how this creates a barrier to robust public participation in the decision-making process, particularly for those in marginalized communities. But as we know, this problem is broader and beyond NGOs and foundations. So Dr. Sheets, communities of color have always been at the forefront of the environmental justice movement, but perhaps don't get as much recognition as other leaders in this space. How do we ensure that communities of color continue leading the conversation and movement? In 30 seconds.
You have to give them the resources so they have the capacity to do so. And we ask that allies who work with us, work with those communities, let those communities lead.
To the point. You got time to spare. Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Mr. Vice Chairman and gentleman yields. Let me now turn to the gentlelady from Massachusetts, Representative Tran. You have 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for your leadership on this issue, and thank you to the witnesses for joining us today to consider this important legislation. You know, as part of today's conversation about environmental justice, I'd like to highlight the important efforts we must take to clean up brownfield sites that litter our communities. In fact, the other committee I sit on, Energy and Commerce, is holding a separate hearing on them today as well. Brownfields, as well as Superfund sites, are disproportionately found in low-income communities like Lowell, where I grew up. They make it hard for businesses to open in these areas, stalling economic development. Now, last May, EPA awarded the city of Lawrence $500,000 brownfield cleanup grant to clean up the Merrimack paper site. Between 1866 and 2005, this site operated as a paper processing and finishing plant. Unfortunately, despite its location in the center of Lawrence along the Merrimack River, the factory produced toxic chemicals, which have contaminated the site with polynuclear, aromatic hydrocarbons, petroleum, heavy metals, and other contaminants that stem from transformers, underground storage tanks, and previous fires within the building. Now, cleaning up the Merrimack paper site will free up nearly 5 acres for redevelopment and make it possible to create a future connection between the Lawrence River Trail and the Merrimack River Trail. Lawrence is not the only community in my district that's coping with brownfields. The city of Lowell has a long history of redeveloping several brownfields into signature projects: the Paul Songus Arena, LaLasha Park, the Jam Garage, the Hamilton Canal District. And these projects demonstrate the incredible potential we have to leverage these contaminated locations from hazardous properties to economic opportunities. Cleaning them up creates jobs as well as room for small businesses to grow. And for communities like Lowell and Lawrence, which have limited green space and vacant land available for redevelopment, converting these spaces into usable land, for example, parks, river walks, and economic opportunity, is just critical. Federal investment in brownfield sites is key to revitalizing communities in Massachusetts and across our country. Fortunately, the bipartisan infrastructure law included $1.5 billion for brownfield remediation and revitalization, and communities like Lawrence and Lowell will be able to use these types of investments to transform contaminated sites into community assets like public parks and green spaces that can help communities thrive and prosper. Ms. Cortez, I know you've already spoke extensively on the importance of brownfields, but can you speak more to the work you do to revitalize brownfields locally and the opportunity we have in these areas to provide healthy outdoor recreation spaces and environmental amenities and environmental justice communities that lack access to such amenities now?
Yes, thank you. I think similar to what you mentioned in Lowell, and I'm sure in other areas as well, our communities, most of the brownfields that I know of were either paint manufacturers, metal manufacturers, chrome platers, and landfills. And so as they leave, right, they leave this behind and leave behind the compound gases, metals on the floor, and other such things that continue to harm the community. One of the big issues and why funding is so important is because what's happening is that private developers purchase these brownfields and they want to turn over their profit. Right. And so what happens is that the only thing that can be redeveloped and because when you redevelop, you have to clean, right? So these developers end up doing a cleanup, but because they have to pay for the cleanup, they make sure that they have a business that is going to yield them a significant amount of profit. And so what we see is that they get cleaned up to put other polluters there. That is literally what we see is they're cleaning up to put more polluters there, and that does not allow for green spaces. And so federal funding that has already come through our hoods is super important to allow for green spaces that we so desperately need to be created. And in addition to that, these sites are so big that what we see is right now in our urban neighborhoods, all we have access to is pocket parks. That's a great start. That is not enough. That is not enough for substantial recreation. And so these types of investments into brownfields are very important.
Yeah, if you could just like bring it home for us. I mean, how will the Environmental Justice for All Act help support the more equitable access to parks and recreational opportunities for these underserved and economically disadvantaged communities?
Yeah, EJ for All will be able to provide funding so that we can have these spaces cleaned and have green spaces accessible to the communities that are most impacted and do not have access currently to these types of facilities.
Thank you so much for that and for all the work that you do. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you very much. Let me introduce not a member of the committee, but part of it today for committee action. Madam Chair, Ms. Maloney, are you joining us or have you joined us? And
Yes, I'm here. We're trying to get the Zoom going,
You're on it, Carolyn.
but I'm on it. Okay.
okay, you're recognized.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you so much, Chairman Grijalva, and thanks to you and Congressman McEachin for writing this terrific bill. Communities like mine need the Environmental Justice for All Act to become law. My constituents in Western Queens live in an area that has become and is called Asthma Alley. Across the street from Queensbridge Houses, the largest public housing development in the country, is the Ravenswood Generating Station, the dirtiest fossil fuel plant in the state. If you can believe it, there are 3 more peakers that burn fossil fuels on the Ravenswood site, 2 more peakers just 2 blocks away, and 10 within a mile. 24 just in that neighborhood and 91 across the city. That is too many, and that's why we have environmental health challenges and problems. Millions of people in New York live within a mile of these plants, and if you live near one, you probably live near many. Enough is enough. We need to stop polluting and harming frontline communities. We need to pass your Environmental Justice for All Act, and we need all members of Congress to go home to their districts, meet with local environmental justice communities, and ask how they can best fight for relief from toxic pollution for constituents that get the short end of the stick every time a polluter comes to town. For some reason in New York, they put all the pollution in one area, and it's really a justice neighborhood usually. The Oversight Committee worked with the environmental justice leaders in New York City's Peak Coalition. We found that while each of the city's 91 peakers and base load plants may stay under emissions thresholds individually, the amount of pollution they screw together is just too much, especially when added to the thousands of gas and diesel boilers and generators in buildings across our city. It's more than our bodies can handle. It's too much for our children. To a child's lungs, it makes no difference if soot comes from one of the smokestacks or from tin. It shouldn't make a difference in the eyes of the law, and with the Environmental Justice for All Act, it won't. In collaboration with Chairman Grijalva, members of his Environmental Justice Working Group, frontline communities across the country, and the authors of the Environmental Justice National Climate Platform, I wrote the Justice and Power Plant Permitting Act to complement his efforts. My bill, HR 6548, builds on environmental justice for all by inserting the cumulative impacts model into the permitting of fossil fuel powered plants and other sources of air pollution and prohibiting these sources if they cause harm. I worked with one of the country's leading practitioners in developing this bill, and he's here today, Dr. Sheets. I'd like to submit a list to the group to the panel, your panel, and to you, Mr. Chairman, of groups across the country that are supporting my bill for the record, and they should be supporting yours. Dr. Sheets, the cumulative impacts framework has been a profound success in state law and state permitting decisions. It's long past time that Congress put in place a national framework. What is your message to members of Congress who may be unfamiliar with this concept or unsure whether to support cumulative impacts bills like Chairman Grijalva's and Congressman McEachin's and mine? Dr. Sheets.
I think that you pretty much said it, but let me add that environmental justice communities, low-income communities, and communities of color have been working towards this for years, saying that this gap in our laws has to be plugged. There has to be some way to take into account the total amount of pollution in the neighborhood. It is just so unfair that these multiple sources keep going into the same neighborhoods. And the time is now. And we are glad so many people are at least starting to listen and taking this seriously. And we really thank you and your colleagues in Congress for paying attention to this issue.
I think another item that is troubling is they took the permitting process and gave it to the states. Yet it's the federal government that wrote the Clean Air, Clean Water Act. And yet they are looking at one source of pollution and adding more peaker plants and more peaker plants to the same neighborhoods. Could you comment on the permitting process and how we could, how we should, it's not working because they're continuing to pollute communities, particularly communities of color, with polluting plants over and over and over again. And they put so many of them in one area.
And the hard reality is that at some point, the permitting process has to say enough is enough. And at some point, due to cumulative impacts and environmental justice, the permitting process has to say, we're not going to put more polluting facilities in these neighborhoods that already have more than their fair share of facilities.
Well, that is the main point I want to make, that we have to change our permitting process and we have to pass the Environmental Justice for All Act. I congratulate Congressman Grijalva and McEachin for their leadership on this. We should pass it out of committee and to the floor for a vote. And I thank you for allowing me to share with you my support for your bill, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. And let me now invite any committee member who has not had the opportunity to comment or to question our witnesses to just ask for time, and I will be more than happy to do that. Otherwise, we'll move into closing the meeting.
Mr. Chair?
Who seeks recognition?
Stauber, Mr. Chair.
Stauber.
Mr. Chair, because my opening statement, we had some technical difficulties, I'm going to ask that my opening statement be put into the record. And then I would ask that Mayor Brower's editorial opinion dated January 24th, 2020 be also placed in the record. And then the last request of you, Mr. Chair, would you please share the letter to Secretary Hallen regarding the Willow Project? Can you share that with the entire committee?
Absolutely, and also all the signatories on the letter as well. And every office will receive it. Thank you for bringing
Mr.
that up.
Chair.
And with that, and so ordered, let me thank the witnesses and the members for their questions. You know, the achieving environmental justice for all is a major priority, and Congress, I really believe, needs to act with the level of urgency that it deserves. And without objection, I would like to enter into the record the many letters of support the committee has received from hundreds of organizations for HR 2021, from grassroots community organization and public health advocates. So ordered. The members of the committee may also have some additional questions, as I do, and we will ask you to respond to those in writing to the witnesses. Under committee rules, the members can submit additional questions to the witnesses within 3 business days following the hearing, and it'll be kept, the record will be kept open for 10 days for these responses. Let me just close by saying, again, thanking the members and the committee. You know, there are so many things that Congress is dealing with and the people of this nation are dealing with right now. And one would wonder, and it sort of came up either by implication or by direct statement, why are we focusing on this right now when we have so many other things that we should be worried about? And, you know, child slave labor, the China and Russia threat, the economic pain that this bill would inflict, inflation, the cost of fuel, cost of energy. And the fact remains that what this legislation is about is fundamental to what we do in Congress and what our role is and what we swear to. And that is fairness and equal protection under the law. It's about corrective action. You know, there's efforts ongoing to erase history, rewrite history, and you can't do either. But you can correct what occurred and make sure that we put in place those protections for generations to come, so we're not revisiting this issue over and over again. And I think that Congresswoman Stansberry said this is not a hypothetical, and it's not. It's quantifiable, and the means to empower and protect all communities equally is before us. And so as we go forward and heading toward a markup, I think we need to keep in mind that this bill is not about ending anything that is positive. It is about ending everything and the legacy that has created a situation. It is no coincidence. This is not just mere happenstance that the concentration of polluting and endangering emissions and discharges in this country happen to be in communities that are predominantly poor, predominantly of color, and adjacent to indigenous and tribal lands in terms of impact. There's no coincidence that when Bismarck didn't want the pipeline going through their town because, quote unquote, it would endanger their water quality and their groundwater, that Dakota pipeline is moved, so now it affects the Sioux tribe, and you wonder why you have a controversy. Here in Tucson, the local county and municipalities, city, want more stringent standards on an emission plan. But as the state environmental quality board says, and the local ones, we don't have the authority to look at EJ impact, at cumulative impact, and to have higher standards because there is no overarching federal guidance and law. That's what we're trying to address. And so I look forward to it. I look forward to your comments. And, you know, in terms of the letter to the mayor, no disrespect. I would hope that everybody
I'm
would
not
be.
sure where we are in the process. I think if and when
somebody's
we
loud.
do have an
And Representative Stauber, just, you know, the position in the letter really boils down to sending a letter demanding more public input after the court decision delayed the action on the Willow project, development project. There was an opportunity, a pause. And that's when that letter went to Interior saying, demanding more local input, given the flawed and questionable process that occurred in the initial study. That's all. So if I'm being castigated for seeking local input, for not seeking local input before I sent a letter seeking more local input, I plead guilty. With that, meeting's adjourned. Thank you very much.